Hi guys, it sounds unbelievable, but pirates brewed tea on their ships because the soft drink gave them a brutal survival advantage no barrel of rum could match. You'll be very surprised when you hear why they drink tea instead of rum. Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them thinking, wait, people in New York listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we are talking about why 18th century pirates preferred tea over rum. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Pillows good, blankets situation handled, perfect. Trust me on this one. You sit on the deck, unaware of what's about to happen, watching the ocean. It's 1721, somewhere off the coast of Madagascar, and the ship beneath your feet is creaking in that specific way that either means everything is fine or everything's about to become very not fine. The sun is setting, which is the only time of day when the Indian Ocean doesn't feel like it's actively trying to cook you inside your own skin. You're a sailor, not by choice exactly, but by a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time and catastrophic in hindsight. The thing about pirate ships that nobody tells you in the stories is how boring they are. Sure, there's the occasional raid, the infrequent battle, the rare moment of genuine terror when you think today might be the day you meet whatever waits beyond. But mostly, it's just water. Miles of it. Endless stretches of absolutely nothing happening while you scrub the same section of deck you scrubbed yesterday and will scrub again tomorrow. Your hands are raw from rope work. Your skin is burned in places and peeling in others. You can't remember the last time you ate something that didn't taste like it had already died twice. But right now, at sunset, there's a routine that makes the whole thing almost bearable. You watch as the cook, a man named Thomas who lost 3 fingers to a cannonball in a fight he refuses to talk about, begins preparing the evening tea. Not rum. Tea. And if you're new to this ship, if you're fresh off some merchant vessel that got a little too confident about its route, you might find this strange. You might even say something about it, make a joke, reference the fact that pirates are supposed to drink rum. That's the whole thing. That's the image, the legend, the expectation. And Thomas will look at you with his remaining 7 fingers gripping a dented kettle, and he'll say absolutely nothing, because Thomas doesn't waste words on the obvious. The older sailors, the ones who've been doing this long enough that their skin looks like leather left out in the sun for several years, they don't say anything either. They just wait for their tea, patient as monks while the sky bleeds orange and pink across the horizon. You learn quickly not to ask questions on a pirate ship, or rather, you learn to ask the right questions at the right time, and why tea instead of rum is apparently not one of them. So you stand there, waiting your turn, watching the ritual unfold with the kind of precision you'd expect from a military operation or a religious ceremony, not from a group of men who technically make their living through theft and violence. The tea isn't fancy. There's no porcelain, no silver spoons, no delicate handling. It gets poured into whatever cup-shaped object you've managed to keep from breaking. Tin mostly, sometimes wood, occasionally something that used to belong to someone else in a previous life. But the care with which it's prepared, the attention to the temperature of the water, the exact amount of leaves, the steeping time, it's all treated with a seriousness that seems wildly disproportionate to the end result. You take your cup when Thomas nods at you, which is his version of gracious hospitality, and you find a place to sit on a coil of rope that's seen better decades. The tea is hot enough to hurt a little going down, and it tastes like dirt and leaves and something faintly floral that your brain can't quite identify. It's not good exactly, but it's not trying to be. It's just tea. Simple, honest, no pretensions about what it is or why it exists. Around you, the other sailors are doing the same thing, settling into their evening positions, cradling their cups with both hands like they're holding something precious. And maybe they are. You start to notice things in the quiet that follows, small details that don't make sense until you've been here long enough for them to form a pattern. The way everyone's hands stop shaking after a few sips, the way conversations start up, real ones, not the performative aggression that defines most of the day. Someone's talking about their sister in Bristol. Another man is describing a dog he had as a child, with the kind of detail that suggests he's described this dog many times before, maybe as a way of proving to himself that his childhood actually happened. Nobody's drunk. That's the thing you notice most. On a pirate ship, at sunset, after a long day of either hard work or harder boredom, nobody's drunk. There's rum on this ship. Barrels of it, probably stolen from some merchant vessel that thought it could outrun a ship that had nothing better to do than chase it. But the rum sits below deck, untouched except for special occasions that seem to occur far less frequently than you'd expect. You're drinking tea instead, and so is everyone else, and the longer you sit there watching the sun disappear into the ocean like it's given up on the whole day, the more you start to understand that this isn't some quirky tradition or eccentric choice. This is survival, not the dramatic kind, not the fighting off attackers or navigating through storms kind, but the slower, more insidious kind that happens when you're surrounded by nothing and nobody for months at a time. The thing about rum, and you're learning this through observation rather than explanation because nobody here has the energy or inclination to sit you down for a lesson, is that it's a liar. It promises warmth, comfort, escape, a brief vacation from whatever circumstances led you to a life of maritime crime, and it delivers, for a little while. But then the morning comes, and the sun is exactly as hot as it was before, and the water is exactly as endless, and your problems haven't gone anywhere, they've just been waiting patiently for you to sober up so they can reintroduce themselves with interest. Tea doesn't promise anything, it's just hot water with leaves in it. But it's reliable, it won't make you stupid, it won't make you slow, it won't make you forget that you're on a ship full of armed men with questionable morals and varying levels of impulse control. You can drink tea and still trust your reflexes, still make decisions that don't seem like good ideas only in retrospect, still remember where you put your knife and why that matters. There's a man sitting near you, older, weathered in a way that suggests he's been weathered multiple times over. His name is something like James or John, you're not entirely sure. Names aren't big on pirate ships. Everyone just sort of exists in nominal ambiguity until they do something memorable enough to earn a descriptor. He's drinking his tea slowly, methodically, like he's performing a task that requires concentration. You watch him for a while, trying to figure out what makes him different from the men you've known on other ships, merchant vessels mostly, where the crew spent their evenings drunk and their mornings regretful. And then it occurs to you, watching him cup his hands around the tin mug, watching the way his shoulders relax incrementally with each sip, that the difference is control. On a merchant ship, you're controlled by the captain, the schedule, the destination, the cargo, the weather, the 1,000 external factors that determine your life without consulting you. But here, on this pirate ship that smells like tar and poor decisions, drinking tea at sunset is a choice. A small one, maybe meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but a choice nonetheless. And in a life where choice is rare and valuable, even choosing what you drink becomes significant. The tea cools in your hands as the last light fades from the sky. Stars start appearing, one by one, like someone's poking holes in a dark curtain from behind. You can hear the water against the hull, that constant sound that becomes so familiar you stop noticing it, except in moments like this, when everything else is quiet enough for background noise to become the main event. The first time you actually asked about the tea, really asked and waited for an answer, instead of just accepting the mystery as part of the general weirdness of pirate life, you were 3 weeks into your unwilling career change from merchant sailor to maritime criminal. You'd been pressed into service after your previous ship had the misfortune of carrying something valuable enough to steal, but not valuable enough to die protecting, which is the sweet spot pirates look for when they're deciding whether to attack or just wave as they pass by. You asked Thomas because Thomas seemed like the kind of person who might answer a direct question with something resembling a direct answer, or at least wouldn't stab you for asking. He was preparing the evening tea, same as always, going through the motions with the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing something hundreds of times. The water was boiling in a kettle that had definitely seen better years, probably on a different ship, maybe in a different ocean entirely. You said something casual, something like, "Why tea? Why not rum like everyone expects, like the songs say, like the stories tell it?" Thomas looked at you for a long moment, long enough that you started wondering if you'd accidentally broken some unspoken rule, crossed some invisible line that separates acceptable curiosity from dangerous ignorance. But then he just shrugged, which was practically a speech coming from him, and said something about clear heads and long voyages, and not wanting to wake up with a headache when there might be actual problems to deal with. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was explaining that water is wet, or that the sky is generally located above the ocean, not below it. But there was something else in his voice, something he wasn't saying directly, and you'd been around long enough to know that what people don't say is often more important than what they do. So you waited, and eventually, because the silence was more uncomfortable for him than talking, Thomas added that rum makes men mean. Not always, not everyone, but enough of the time and enough of the men that it becomes a problem on a ship where everyone's armed and nobody's got anywhere to go if things get violent. Tea, he said, doesn't make anyone mean, it just makes them slightly more awake and possibly in need of urinating later, which is manageable. You think about this now, sitting on your coil of rope, watching the stars multiply across the sky like they're breeding up there. The ship rocks gently, that constant motion that you've learned to walk with, to sleep with, to live with until you can't imagine solid ground anymore. Somewhere below deck, someone's playing a fiddle, badly but with enough enthusiasm that it almost compensates for the lack of skill. The melody is something vaguely Irish, or maybe Scottish, you can't tell, and it probably doesn't matter, because the person playing it definitely can't tell either. The tea has gone lukewarm in your cup, which is somehow worse than hot or cold, just existing in that middle space of disappointment. But you drink it anyway, because wasting it feels wrong in a way you can't quite articulate. There's not an abundance of anything on this ship except water and wood and the persistent smell of unwashed men living in close quarters. Tea is rationed, carefully measured, treated with a respect usually reserved for gunpowder or fresh water, or the captain's personal effects. You start noticing patterns after a few weeks of the same routine. The tea happens every evening at sunset, unless there's a storm, and even then someone will try to make it happen once the immediate danger of dying has passed. It's not optional exactly, but nobody forces you to participate either. It's just something that happens, and you can either be part of it or sit elsewhere and wonder what you're missing. Most people choose to be part of it, even the ones who probably genuinely would prefer rum, because being alone on a ship full of people is somehow worse than being alone actually alone. There's a hierarchy to who gets served first, but it's not based on rank or experience or who's most intimidating. It's based on something more subtle, something you're still learning to read. The quiet men get served first, the ones who don't cause problems, who do their work without complaining, who've been on this ship long enough to be considered furniture. Then everyone else, in no particular order that you can determine, until finally Thomas serves himself, always last, like he's making sure everyone else is taken care of before he sits down. You wonder sometimes what would happen if someone broke the ritual, if someone demanded rum instead of tea, made a big show of rejecting the whole thing. But nobody does, and you suspect nobody will, because the ritual isn't really about the tea, it's about the pause. The moment in the day when everyone stops pretending to be the violent, dangerous, rum-soaked pirates that the stories describe, and just becomes tired men drinking hot leaf water while the sun goes down and the stars come out, and another day passes that they somehow survived. The fiddle player below deck has given up on the Irish or Scottish tune and moved on to something slower, something that might be a hymn if you squint your ears and ignore the parts where he's clearly improvising because he's forgotten the actual melody. Nobody tells him to stop. Nobody tells him he's terrible. The music just exists, floating up through the deck boards, mixing with the sound of water and wood, and breathing. The history of tea on pirate ships isn't written down anywhere official, which makes sense because pirates weren't big on official documentation for obvious legal reasons. But if you talk to enough old sailors, the ones who've been doing this since before you were born, who've seen ships come and go, and captains rise and fall, you start to piece together a story that's less about preference and more about necessity, wrapped in tradition, wrapped in something that might be wisdom if you're being generous. Tea came to the Caribbean and the Atlantic pirate routes through the East India Company, which is ironic, in a way that would be funny if it wasn't so typical of how things actually work. The same company that was making fortunes shipping tea from China and India to Europe was also inadvertently supplying the pirates who raided their ships. Every captured merchant vessel was a floating store of whatever it happened to be carrying, and increasingly, especially by the early 1700s, that meant tea. Lots of it. Crates and crates of dried leaves that the average pirate crew initially had no idea what to do with. You imagine the first pirates encountering tea, standing around these wooden crates they'd pried open expecting to find something valuable, something useful, something they could sell or use or at least understand. And instead they found leaves. Just dried leaves that smelled vaguely pleasant but didn't seem to serve any obvious purpose. Someone probably tried smoking them, because pirates tried smoking everything at least once to see what would happen. Someone else probably tried eating them straight, which would have been disappointing in a way that's hard to overstate. But eventually, maybe through captured crew members who knew what tea was, maybe through trial and error, maybe through sheer boredom and a willingness to experiment with anything that might break up the monotony of ship life, someone figured out that you could put the leaves in hot water and create a drink that was, at minimum, warm and different from water. And in a life where warm and different from water counted as luxury, that was enough to get people interested. The transition from curiosity to routine probably took years, maybe decades. You picture different crews on different ships slowly discovering that tea had properties beyond just being warm and leaf-flavoured. It didn't spoil like milk. It didn't require refrigeration that didn't exist yet anyway. It could be stored for months, maybe years if kept dry, which made it more practical than almost any other beverage besides water and alcohol. And unlike alcohol, it didn't impair your ability to do things like navigate, fight, or make decisions that didn't seem catastrophically stupid in hindsight. There's a man on this ship, everyone calls him Cork because he's from Cork and pirates aren't creative with nicknames, who claims his grandfather sailed with Henry Every back in the 1690s. You're not sure if this is true, or if Cork just likes having a connection to pirate royalty, but he tells stories sometimes after the evening tea, when everyone's settled and quiet, and willing to listen to an old man ramble about things that may or may not have happened. According to Cork, or according to Cork's alleged grandfather, or according to whoever actually started this story before it got passed down and embellished and probably completely transformed, Henry Every's crew started drinking tea regularly after raiding a Mughal ship in 1695. The ship was carrying treasure, obviously, that's why they raided it, but it was also carrying tea for the Mughal nobles who were travelling on it. And the pirates, not knowing what else to do with it, started preparing it the way they'd seen it prepared, which involved a lot of guessing, and probably got most of the details wrong but produced something drinkable. The story goes, and again you're filtering this through Cork's dramatic retelling which includes sound effects and hand gestures that seem unnecessary, that Every's crew noticed something after a few weeks of regular tea drinking. They were fighting less, not because they'd suddenly become peaceful, or philosophical, or had resolved their deep-seated issues with authority and social norms, but because they were slightly less drunk all the time, which meant slightly less prone to the kind of arguments that escalate into knife fights over things like who ate whose biscuit, or who looked at whose hammock wrong. Every, who was apparently a practical man despite being a pirate, noticed this pattern and made tea a regular part of the ship's routine, not mandatory, not enforced with punishment, just available and encouraged and eventually normalized to the point where it became what everyone did. Other crews heard about it, tried it themselves, found similar results, and slowly, through the kind of organic information spread that happens when people are all facing the same problems and looking for solutions that work, tea became a pirate staple. You don't know how much of this is true. Cork also claims his grandfather once arm wrestled a whale and won, which seems statistically unlikely, but the core of the story feels right in a way that's hard to argue with. Pirates weren't stupid. Violent, yes. Criminal, obviously. But not stupid. And if drinking tea meant fewer internal conflicts, better decision-making, and a crew that could function effectively when they needed to, then drinking tea was simply the logical choice regardless of what the songs and stories said pirates were supposed to do. The stars are fully out now, dense and bright in a way they never are on land where city lights and smoke and general human presence dims everything. Out here, with nothing but ocean in all directions, the stars feel close enough to touch, like you could reach up and grab one if you were tall enough or foolish enough to try. The practical advantages of tea over rum become more obvious the longer you spend on this ship, watching how the crew functions, how decisions get made, how conflicts get resolved or don't get resolved depending on who's involved and what time of day it is. You're learning to read the patterns, the subtle shifts in mood and energy that determine whether today is going to be boring or interesting. And interesting, on a pirate ship, is rarely the good kind of interesting. Morning is when the real work happens, when the difference between tea drinkers and rum drinkers would become most apparent if there were any rum drinkers to compare against. The crew wakes up with the sun, or slightly before it if there's work that needs doing, and nobody's hungover. Nobody's moving slowly, carefully, trying not to jostle their own head too much. Nobody's making promises to themselves about drinking less tonight that they'll definitely break by sunset. Everyone just gets up and starts the day like functional human beings, which sounds basic, but is apparently revolutionary in the context of 18th century maritime culture. You're on deck before dawn one morning, can't sleep because the ship's rocking different than usual, and your body noticed even if your brain didn't, and you watch the crew emerge from below deck one by one. They look tired, because everyone on a ship looks tired all the time. That's just the baseline state of existence when you're living on wood and salt water and questionable food. But they're alert, their eyes focus properly, their hands are steady when they start working on the rigging, checking the sails, doing all the maintenance tasks that keep a ship from becoming a floating coffin. Thomas is already up, naturally, because Thomas seems to exist in a state of perpetual wakefulness that borders on supernatural. He's got the morning tea going, a different blend than the evening one, something that smells sharper, more aggressive, like it's personally offended by the concept of sleepiness. You take a cup when he offers it, and the first sip makes your eyes water slightly, but in a good way, in a way that makes your brain remember it's supposed to be awake and functional. The captain emerges last, which is his privilege as captain, though he never abuses it by sleeping late or making everyone wait. He's a man named Edward, though everyone calls him Captain or Sir, or sometimes just a meaningful grunt depending on the situation and their relationship with authority. He takes his tea from Thomas with a nod, drinks it while surveying the deck like he's checking for problems he hopes not to find, and you notice the way his whole demeanour shifts as he wakes up fully. From groggy to alert, from uncertain to decisive, all facilitated by hot water and leaves. There's a story you heard, third-hand so probably exaggerated, about a pirate ship that tried to maintain the traditional rum-soaked lifestyle that everyone expects from pirates. The captain encouraged drinking, kept the rum flowing freely, figured that happy drunk pirates were loyal pirates, and for a while, maybe it worked, but then one morning they got attacked by a naval vessel while most of the crew was still drunk or hungover from the night before, and the resulting battle was apparently less a battle and more a massacre, because drunk people are terrible at fighting even when they're experienced fighters when sober. The ship got captured, the crew got hanged, and the story became one of those cautionary tales that gets passed around between ships whenever someone suggests that maybe they should relax the tea policy and break out the rum more often. Nobody knows if it actually happened, or if it's just a useful fiction that someone invented to make a point, but either way it serves its purpose. Tea keeps you alive, rum gets you hanged. The math is simple, even for people who can't do math. You're scrubbing the deck, which is your primary job description and will continue to be your primary job description until you either die or prove yourself useful at something else. When Cork settles down near you with his own cup of tea, he's in a talking mood, which you can tell because he's got that look on his face like he's about to share wisdom whether you want it or not. You keep scrubbing, because the deck doesn't care about Cork's wisdom, and will still need scrubbing regardless, but you listen, because Cork gets offended if you don't, and offended Cork is exhausting. He tells you about a ship he served on years ago, before this one, where the captain tried to ban alcohol entirely, not just reduce it, or make it occasional, but completely eliminate it from ship life. And the crew nearly mutinied, not because they were addicts who couldn't function without alcohol, but because the ban felt authoritarian in a way that didn't sit right with men who'd specifically chosen piracy as a career path, because they didn't like being told what to do. The captain backed down, allowed rum back on the ship, and promptly watched his crew devolve into the exact problems that made him want to ban it in the first place. The solution, Cork explains while watching you scrub like he's supervising even though he's clearly not, is choice. The tea is available, encouraged, normalized, but not mandatory. The rum is available too, technically, but discouraged through social pressure and practical example, rather than through rules and punishment. You can drink rum if you want, nobody will stop you, but you'll be doing it alone while everyone else is having tea together, and humans are social creatures even when they're pirates, maybe especially when they're pirates, so the social pressure works better than any rule could. It's a delicate balance, Cork says, and you believe him because Cork is old enough to have seen what happens when the balance tips too far in either direction. Too much control, and people rebel. Too little structure, and people destroy themselves. Tea, somehow, exists in the middle ground, where it's structured enough to provide routine and community, but flexible enough that nobody feels oppressed by it. The East India Company never intended to supply pirates with tea, obviously. Their business model was specifically designed around not having their cargo stolen by maritime criminals. But intention and reality rarely align perfectly, especially in the 18th century when the gap between Europe and Asia was measured in months of dangerous sailing, and the concept of supply chain management was more wishful thinking than actual strategy. You learn about the East India Company through fragments of conversation, stories told by sailors who used to work legitimate merchant routes before piracy seemed like a better option, and your own observations of the tea crates that occasionally appear in the ship's hold after a successful raid. The company was, by all accounts, monumentally powerful in a way that made regular governments nervous. They had their own army, their own fleet, their own territories, and a monopoly on trade routes that made them richer than most countries. But they also had a problem, which was that their ships were slow, predictable, and full of valuable cargo that was relatively easy to steal if you had a fast ship and a flexible moral compass. Pirates knew the routes, knew the schedules, knew where the company's ships would be and when they'd be there. It was like hunting animals that walked the same path every day at the same time, except the animals were full of tea and silk and spices and other things that could be sold for actual money. The irony, and you're developing an appreciation for irony because pirate life is full of it, is that by creating such an efficient and profitable tea trade, the East India Company made tea accessible to the exact people they were trying to keep it away from. Every captured ship was a redistribution of wealth and goods, a forced democratization of luxury items that were supposed to be reserved for the wealthy European consumers who could afford them. You're in the hold one afternoon, sent down to fetch something for Thomas, and you take a moment to actually look at the tea crates stacked against the wall. They're stamped with the company's mark, official and legitimate, and completely stolen. Each crate represents someone's investment, someone's profit margin, someone's business plan that didn't account for pirates drinking their product instead of Europeans buying it. There's something satisfying about that, even though you're aware that satisfaction over other people's misfortune is probably not the most admirable character trait to develop. The tea inside these crates isn't all the same. You learn this gradually, through trial and error, and paying attention to which crates Thomas goes to for morning tea versus evening tea, versus special occasions that may or may not actually be special, but provide an excuse to break out the good stuff. There's black tea, green tea, tea that smells like flowers, tea that smells like smoke, tea that tastes bitter, tea that tastes sweet, tea that probably had a specific name and purpose that nobody on this ship knows or cares about. Thomas has his favourites, which he guards jealously, and only uses when he's in a particularly good mood, or when the captain specifically requests it. There's one type, you don't know what it's called, but it comes in a crate with red markings, that Thomas treats like it's made of gold and angel tears. He uses it sparingly, measuring it out in tiny portions, and the resulting tea is smooth and complex in a way that makes you understand why people in England were willing to pay absurd amounts of money for something that's ultimately just dried leaves. You wonder sometimes what happens to the tea market when pirates keep stealing it. Does the price go up because supply is interrupted? Does the East India Company factor piracy into their business costs like it's just another expense? Do the wealthy Europeans who drink tea every afternoon know that somewhere in the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, pirates are drinking the same thing while planning their next raid? Probably not. Probably they drink their tea in fancy parlours with fancy cups and never think about where it comes from or who else might be enjoying it in significantly less fancy circumstances. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing that you're drinking the same tea as some aristocrat in London, even though you're drinking it from a dented tin cup on a ship that smells like tar and sweat, while the aristocrat is probably drinking it from porcelain in a room that smells like perfume and wealth. The tea doesn't care about the context. It tastes the same regardless of who's drinking it or why, which is weirdly democratic for a product that's supposed to represent luxury and social status. The evening tea ritual is starting above deck. You can hear the sounds of people settling in, the particular shuffle of feet and creak of wood that means everyone's finding their spots. You grab what you came down here for, and head back up, emerging into the golden late afternoon light that makes everything look more beautiful than it actually is. The ocean is calm today, barely moving, like it's tired and decided to take a break from being dramatic. Thomas sees you and nods toward the kettle, which is his way of asking if you want tea, and you nod back, which is your way of saying yes because verbal communication is apparently optional on this ship. You take your cup and find your usual spot on the coil of rope that you've mentally claimed as yours, even though nothing on this ship actually belongs to anyone except the captain and maybe Thomas's good tea. The tea is hot and bitter and perfect in the way that things are perfect when you've spent all day working and you're tired, and this is the one moment of comfort you get before you have to sleep and wake up and do it all again tomorrow. The social dynamics of tea drinking on a pirate ship are more complex than you initially realized, which seems ridiculous because it's just tea, just a beverage, just leaves in hot water. But nothing on a ship is ever simple, and the evening tea ritual has layers of meaning and unspoken rules that you're still learning to navigate even after months of participation. There's a hierarchy, but it's not the obvious one. The captain doesn't sit at the center of everything demanding attention and deference. He sits slightly apart, close enough to be part of the group, but far enough to maintain the necessary distance that leadership requires. You can't be everyone's friend when you might have to order them into danger, or make decisions that get some of them killed. The tea ritual acknowledges this. The captain drinks the same tea as everyone else, from a cup that's no fancier than anyone else's, but he drinks it in a space that's physically and socially separate. The real center of the evening ritual is Thomas, which makes sense because he's the one preparing and serving the tea. But it's more than that. Thomas has become something like a priest or a bartender, roles that are surprisingly similar when you think about it. People confide in him, they ask his advice, they seek his approval in small ways, trying to catch his eye when they say something they think is clever or important. Thomas rarely responds with more than a grunt or a nod, but those grunts and nods carry weight. A positive grunt from Thomas can improve your standing in the crew's informal social structure more effectively than any amount of bravery or skill. You watch the interactions play out every evening, learning to read the subtle cues that indicate who's in favor and who's not, who's having a good day and who's barely holding it together. There's a young sailor, can't be more than 16, who joined the crew a few weeks after you did. He's having a hard time adjusting, you can tell, missing home probably, or missing the version of his life where he wasn't a criminal living on a wooden box surrounded by water and questionable company. The kid sits alone most evenings, taking his tea but not really participating in the conversations that develop around him. And you notice the older sailors, the ones who've been here long enough to have seen dozens of new crew members come and go, making small gestures of inclusion, offering him a better seat, asking simple questions that don't require complicated answers, sharing a biscuit that's only slightly stale. These are men who will kill without hesitation if the situation requires it, but they're also capable of kindness, of recognizing when someone needs help even if that someone won't ask for it. The tea facilitates this somehow. It creates a space where these interactions can happen naturally, without anyone having to acknowledge that they're being deliberately kind, which would be embarrassing for everyone involved. Pirates have reputations to maintain after all. Can't go around being openly compassionate. That would undermine the whole terrifying criminal image that keeps merchant ships from fighting back too hard. There's a conversation happening near you, two sailors arguing about navigation, which route is faster to wherever the captain has decided you're going next. It's a technical argument, full of terms you barely understand about currents and winds and the behavior of water when it's being moved by forces you can't see. Neither man is getting angry, which would happen if they were drunk, if rum was facilitating this conversation instead of tea. They're just talking, disagreeing, explaining their reasoning, actually listening to each other's points. It's weirdly civilized for a pirate ship. You think about your previous life on merchant vessels, where evening meant drunk sailors and stupid arguments and occasional violence that everyone pretended to forget about the next morning. The contrast is stark. These pirates, these criminals who've rejected society's rules and structure, have somehow created a more functional social environment than the legitimate sailors you used to work with. It's backwards and confusing, and makes you question assumptions about how things are supposed to work. Cork appears next to you, because Cork has a supernatural ability to appear whenever you're thinking about something he'd like to comment on. He's holding his tea and wearing an expression that suggests he's about to say something he thinks is profound. You brace yourself, because Cork's profound observations are hit or miss, mostly miss, but occasionally he lands on something actually worth hearing. He tells you about a captain he sailed under years ago who tried to run the ship like a democracy, letting the crew vote on major decisions, distributing authority more equally. It was a disaster, Cork says, because pirates are criminals specifically because they don't play well with authority and structure, but they're also not equipped to create their own functional government from scratch. The democratic ship devolved into factions and arguments and eventually a mutiny that was technically successful, but left everyone worse off than before. The lesson, according to Cork, is that pirates need structure, but they can't acknowledge that they need structure because that would contradict their entire identity as people who reject structure. So the structure has to be subtle, built into rituals and routines that feel voluntary even when they're not really voluntary at all. The tea ritual is structure disguised as choice. You can skip it if you want, nobody will force you to participate, but the social cost of skipping it is high enough that almost nobody does. You're not sure if Cork is right, or if he's just making connections that sound meaningful, but don't actually hold up under scrutiny. But it feels true in the moment, sitting here with your tea, while the sun sets and the crew settles into their evening positions, like actors hitting their marks in a play they've performed 1,000 times before. The health benefits of tea, which you're learning about through observation and occasional comments from the ship's surgeon, who's really more of a guy who's slightly better at medicine than everyone else, are apparently significant enough to matter, even if nobody talks about them directly. Pirates are not known for their commitment to personal wellness and preventive health care, but the tea is doing things that rum definitely wasn't doing, and even the most skeptical crew members have started to notice. The surgeon, whose name is William but everyone calls him Sawbones for reasons you don't want to know about, mentions one evening that scurvy is less common on ships that drink tea regularly. He says it casually, like he's commenting on the weather, but you know enough about scurvy to understand that this is actually important information. Scurvy is the slow, horrible death that happens when you don't get enough fresh fruit or vegetables, which is most of the time on a ship, because fresh anything is a rare luxury that spoils quickly. The symptoms start subtle. You've seen it on other ships. Fatigue, weakness, irritability, that might just be normal irritability until it gets worse. Then the bleeding gums, the loose teeth, the bruising that appears for no reason, the wounds that won't heal. Eventually, if you don't get vitamin C from somewhere, you just die, slowly and painfully, while your body falls apart from the inside. It's not a good way to go. Actually, There probably aren't any good ways to go, but scurvy is definitely one of the worst ones. Tea apparently contains small amounts of vitamin C, not enough to prevent scurvy entirely if you're getting nothing else, but enough to slow it down, to buy time, to keep the crew functional longer between ports where they can get fresh supplies. William explains this in his usual detached way, like he's discussing interesting facts about a disease, rather than a constant threat that kills sailors regularly. He mentions that green tea has more vitamin C than black tea, which explains why Thomas occasionally breaks out the green stuff even though most of the crew prefers black. But the health benefits go beyond scurvy prevention. The tea seems to help with digestion, which matters when you're eating ship food that's designed for longevity rather than nutritional value or taste. Hard biscuits that could double as building materials. Salted meat that's been salted so heavily it's more salt than meat. Dried beans that require hours of soaking before they're even theoretically edible. Your digestive system is under constant assault from this diet, and the tea apparently helps everything keep moving in the right direction, which is a gross thing to think about, but an important thing to appreciate. There's also something about the ritual of drinking hot liquid that's psychologically beneficial, according to William, who read books once and likes to remind everyone of this fact. Humans respond to warmth and routine, he says. The hot tea triggers some kind of relaxation response in the brain. Tells your body that you're safe enough to stop being constantly alert, that you can rest for a moment without something trying to kill you. On a pirate ship, where something trying to kill you is always a legitimate possibility, these moments of perceived safety matter more than they would on land. You've noticed that you sleep better on nights when you have the evening tea versus nights when you skip it for some reason. Your dreams are less chaotic, less full of the anxiety and stress that builds up during the day. You wake up feeling more rested, or at least less exhausted, which is the best you can hope for when you're sleeping in a hammock that sways with every movement of the ship, and you're surrounded by the sounds of other men sleeping, which is never quiet and often actively unpleasant. The younger sailor, the 16-year-old who's been having a hard time, seems to be adjusting better lately. You see him participating more in conversations, laughing occasionally at jokes that aren't even that funny, just existing in the space with less obvious discomfort. You wonder how much of this is the tea, and how much is just time and adaptation, probably both. The tea creates the environment where adaptation can happen, where the kid can slowly integrate into the crew without anyone making a big deal about it. There's a moment, right before full darkness, when the sky does this thing where it turns colours that don't seem like they should exist in nature. Deep purples and oranges and pinks that blend into each other like someone spilled paint across the horizon. Everyone stops talking to watch it, which happens almost every evening. This collective pause to acknowledge that sometimes the world is beautiful even when you're living on a pirate ship, and your life choices have been questionable at best. The tea is cool now, almost cold, but you finish it anyway, because wasting it still feels wrong. Thomas is already cleaning up, collecting cups from people who've finished, preparing for the morning routine that will start again in a few hours. The captain stands and stretches, which is the signal that the evening ritual is officially over, that everyone can go back to their regular activities, or head below deck to sleep, or do whatever it is people do in their limited free time on a ship. You stay sitting for a bit longer, watching the last light fade completely, waiting for the stars to become bright enough to count. There's a peace to these moments that you didn't expect to find in this life. Not happiness exactly, but something like contentment, or at least the absence of active misery. The tea is part of it, the routine is part of it, but mostly it's the realization that humans can create small pockets of civilization and care, even in circumstances that seem designed to prevent exactly that. The economics of tea on a pirate ship are stranger than you initially considered, and you only start thinking about them after Cork mentions that the crew could sell their stolen tea for significant profit, but chooses not to, which seems counterintuitive for people whose entire lifestyle is based on stealing things and then selling them for profit. You're sitting on deck during the afternoon lull, that time of day when the work is done but evening hasn't started yet, and everyone's just existing in a state of suspended activity. Cork explains, with the patience of someone who's explained this before and will probably explain it again, that tea is valuable precisely because they don't sell it. A ship that has tea, that drinks it regularly, that maintains the supply through careful rationing and occasional raids, is a ship that functions better than other ships. and a ship that functions better can pull off more successful raids, which means more profit overall, which means the tea pays for itself indirectly by making the crew more effective at their actual job of stealing things. It's an investment, basically. The tea they drink is worth less as a sold commodity than it is as a tool for maintaining crew cohesion and functionality. You're drinking your profits, but you're also improving your ability to generate future profits, and the math works out in favor of drinking it rather than selling it. This is apparently a radical concept in the pirate world, where the traditional approach is to steal everything and sell everything, and then wonder why your crew is dysfunctional and your ship is falling apart. There are other ships, Cork says, that do sell all their tea, that see it as just another commodity to be converted into money as quickly as possible. Those ships have more money in the short term, but more problems in the long term. Higher crew turnover, because people get sick or die or desert at the next port. More internal conflicts that sometimes escalate into actual mutinies. Less coordination during raids because everyone's slightly drunk or hungover or just not functioning at full capacity. The money doesn't help if you're dead or imprisoned, and tea helps you stay not dead and not imprisoned. You think about the last raid you participated in, which was your first raid actually, a terrifying experience that you're still processing in fragments whenever your brain has spare capacity to deal with trauma. The merchant ship wasn't expecting pirates, or wasn't expecting pirates who were sober and coordinated, and the whole thing was over in less than an hour, with minimal violence because the captain made smart decisions quickly, and the crew executed those decisions without anyone doing anything catastrophically stupid. You remember thinking during the raid that everyone seemed unusually competent for criminals, that the level of coordination and communication was higher than you'd experienced on legitimate merchant vessels with trained professional sailors, and you're realizing now that the tea is part of that competence, not the whole explanation obviously, but a significant contributing factor. Clear heads make better decisions. Better decisions lead to successful raids. Successful raids mean everyone gets paid and survives to raid again. The captain has a policy, which you learned about recently when someone asked about it directly, that a certain percentage of every raid's profit gets invested back into supplies that improve the ship's long-term functionality. Good rope, quality tools, medical supplies, and tea. Lots of tea. More tea than seems necessary, until you understand that the tea is infrastructure, not luxury. It's like maintaining the sails or fixing leaks or keeping the gunpowder dry. It's basic ship maintenance that happens to take the form of a pleasant beverage. There's a ledger somewhere, you've never seen it but you know it exists, where Thomas tracks the tea inventory and usage, how much they have, how much they're using daily, how long until they need to replenish supplies. He treats it with the same seriousness that the quartermaster treats ammunition and food stores. Running out of tea isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a crisis that needs to be prevented through careful planning and rationing. You've noticed that Thomas serves smaller portions during periods when supplies are running low, stretching what they have until the next raid or the next port. Nobody complains about this, which is remarkable given that pirates are not known for their patience with rationing. But everyone understands that smaller portions are better than no portions, and no portions means going back to rum, and nobody actually wants to go back to rum even if they won't say it directly. The younger sailor approaches you, hesitant like he's worried about bothering you, and asks if you know when the next raid is planned. You don't, because that information gets shared on a need-to-know basis, and you apparently don't need to know yet, but you appreciate that he feels comfortable enough to ask. A few weeks ago he wouldn't have approached anyone with questions, would have just sat with his uncertainty and let it grow into anxiety. You tell him you don't know, but that raids happen when opportunities present themselves, which is both true and completely unhelpful. He nods like this answers his question, and then asks, more quietly, if raids are always as scary as everyone says they are. And you're honest with him, because he deserves honesty even if honesty isn't comforting. And you tell him yes, they're terrifying every single time, but the fear gets more manageable with experience, becomes something you can function through rather than something that paralyzes you completely. He seems to appreciate this, or at least he doesn't look more worried than before, which counts as success in this context. You offer him some of your afternoon water ration, which is a small gesture but meaningful in the economy of ship life, where everything is scarce and sharing means something. He accepts it with visible gratitude, drinks it slowly like he's trying to make it last. The cultural clash between tea-drinking pirates and rum-drinking pirates occasionally becomes visible when different ships interact, which happens more often than you'd expect given that pirates are criminals who theoretically should avoid each other to minimize competition and conflict. But the ocean is only so big, and certain ports and routes get used by everyone, and sometimes ships end up in the same place at the same time and have to figure out how to coexist temporarily. You're in port, a semi-legal settlement on an island whose name you either never learned or immediately forgot because all these islands blur together after a while. It's the kind of place where authorities are either absent or paid to look the other way, where merchants ask fewer questions than usual, where pirates can resupply and rest without worrying too much about being arrested or hanged. The port is crowded with ships, maybe a dozen of them, flying various flags or no flags, all pretending to be something they're not, for the sake of maintaining the thin fiction that allows this place to exist. Your crew ends up at a tavern that's really just someone's house, where they sell alcohol and allow people to sit down, which qualifies as a tavern in this context. The other crew is already there, loud and drunk even though it's barely afternoon, celebrating something, or mourning something, or just drinking, because that's what they do. You recognize them as pirates immediately, something about the way they carry themselves, the way they're armed even in a supposedly safe space, the general energy of men who've chosen violence as a career path. Thomas orders tea, because of course he does, and the tavern keeper looks confused like maybe he misheard, and Thomas repeats his order with the patience of someone who's had this interaction before and will have it again. The other crew finds this hilarious for reasons that probably make sense when you're drunk at 2 in the afternoon. One of them, a large man with a scar that bisects his face in a way that makes you not want to know the story, makes a comment about tea-drinking pirates being a contradiction in terms, an insult to the profession. Your captain, who's been sitting quietly and probably wishing he was back on the ship away from drunk strangers, responds without apparent emotion that his crew drinks tea and hasn't been captured or killed yet, which is more than can be said for many rum-drinking pirates who are currently either imprisoned or dead. The large scarred man processes this statement, trying to determine if it's an insult or just a factual observation, and decides it's probably both. The tension in the room shifts, becomes something that could escalate into violence, or could dissipate, depending on what happens in the next few seconds. You're aware of where your knife is, how quickly you could reach it, which exits are available if this situation deteriorates into something that requires escaping. The other crew is drunk and outnumbers you, but your crew is sober and probably smarter, and it's not clear which advantage is more significant in a potential fight. But then the scarred man laughs, a genuine laugh that seems to surprise him as much as everyone else, and says something about how maybe tea isn't so bad if it keeps you alive long enough to enjoy your stolen money. The tension breaks. The moment passes, your captain nods slightly, acknowledgement without friendship, and everyone goes back to their drinks, tea and rum coexisting in the same space, without further conflict. You drink your tea, which is terrible because the tavern keeper clearly has no idea how to prepare it properly, but it's still tea, still familiar, still a connection to the ship and the routine that's become your life. The rum-drinking pirates are getting louder, more aggressive, their movements becoming less coordinated as the afternoon progresses. You watch them with something like anthropological interest, observing a lifestyle you're no longer part of, seeing the trajectory of the evening written in their current behavior. One of them is picking a fight with another one over something trivial. You can't hear the details, but the body language is clear. Shoving, posturing, the kind of aggressive display that drunk men perform when they want to fight, but also want to feel like they were provoked into fighting rather than choosing it themselves. Their crewmates are either encouraging it or ignoring it. Nobody's trying to diffuse the situation because why would they? Entertainment is scarce in pirate life, and watching your crewmates beat each other up is free. Your crew is having a quiet conversation about supplies and routes, boring practical topics that matter more than pride or ego or whatever the drunk pirates are fighting about. William is explaining something about tides to the younger sailor, using his empty cup as a visual aid, being patient and thorough in a way that drunk people rarely manage. Cork is telling another story, naturally, but keeping his voice low enough that it's not disrupting other conversations. The difference between the two crews is stark, and getting starker as the afternoon progresses into evening. The rum drinkers are losing coherence, becoming less like people and more like forces of nature, loud and unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Your crew is just existing, maintaining baseline functionality, ready to leave when the captain decides it's time to leave, rather than staying until they're thrown out or arrested, or involved in whatever chaos the drunk pirates inevitably create. You finish your tea and wait for the captain's signal. The sun is setting outside, visible through the open door, painting the sky in those impossible colors that happen near the ocean. Another day ending, another evening ritual about to begin back on the ship. You're ready to leave this tavern and these drunk strangers, ready to return to the familiar discomfort of ship life and the small comforts of routine and tea and people who are mostly predictable most of the time. The preparation of tea becomes something you pay more attention to after watching Thomas do it hundreds of times, noticing the small variations in his technique, depending on what kind of tea he's preparing, what time of day it is, what the weather is doing, and probably other factors he's never explained and you've never thought to ask about. There's a precision to it that seems unnecessary until you taste the results of precise preparation versus careless preparation, and the difference is significant enough that even pirates who aren't generally known for their refined palates can tell. Water temperature matters, which you learned when you tried to help Thomas one evening and got the water too hot, resulting in tea that tasted bitter and angry, like you'd personally offended the leaves by scolding them. Thomas didn't say anything, just tasted it, made a face, and dumped the entire batch overboard despite the waste, which is how you knew you'd messed up badly. He started over, waiting for the water to cool slightly from boiling, testing it in ways you couldn't quite understand, some combination of visual assessment and intuition that came from experience you didn't have. The steeping time matters too. Too short, and the tea is weak, barely distinguishable from regular water except for a slight color and the awareness that you're drinking something that used to be leaves. Too long, and it becomes too strong, overwhelming. The kind of thing that makes your face do involuntary expressions while you're trying to maintain dignity. Thomas has the timing memorized, different durations for different teas, counting in his head, or maybe just feeling when it's ready, through some sense that develops when you've made tea every day for years. The ratio of leaves to water is apparently an art form disguised as a simple measurement. Too many leaves, and you're wasting valuable resources while also making tea that's unpleasantly potent. Too few leaves, and you might as well be drinking hot water, which is free and doesn't require stealing it from merchant ships. Thomas measures by eye, grabbing what looks like the right amount, and he's somehow always correct, producing consistent results despite the lack of any formal measurement system. You've started trying to learn these skills, not because Thomas asked you to, but because it seems useful, like having a trade or a specialty that makes you valuable beyond your ability to scrub decks and follow orders. Thomas tolerates your interest with his usual minimal communication style, letting you watch, occasionally correcting you with a grunt or a gesture, slowly allowing you to participate in the preparation process under his supervision. The other sailors have noticed your apprenticeship, though nobody comments on it directly, because direct communication is apparently against ship culture, but you catch approving nods, small acknowledgements that learning a useful skill is worthwhile, that becoming the backup tea person in case something happens to Thomas is a legitimate contribution to the crew's long-term survival. You're not just a deck scrubber anymore, you're a deck scrubber who can also make acceptable tea, which is a meaningful upgrade in the ship's informal hierarchy. There's a complexity to tea that you're only beginning to appreciate. The green tea is delicate, requires cooler water and shorter steeping times, tastes lighter and somehow greener than you'd expect from something that's brown when dried. The black tea is more forgiving, tolerates mistakes better, produces a robust flavor that works well for morning drinking when people need something assertive to help them wake up. The special tea that Thomas guards carefully, the one from the crates with red markings, requires its own specific preparation that he hasn't fully taught you yet, like there are levels to this apprenticeship and you haven't earned access to the advanced techniques. You're practicing with a small pot of water one afternoon, trying to get the temperature right without Thomas's supervision, when the younger sailor approaches and asks if you can teach him. He says it hesitantly, like he's expecting rejection, and you realize he sees you the way you see Thomas, as someone who has knowledge worth learning. It's a strange feeling, being viewed as competent at something, being approached as a teacher rather than just another confused crew member trying to figure out how things work. You show him what you know, which isn't much but is more than he knows, and you try to channel Thomas's teaching style of mostly silence punctuated by occasional corrections. The kid is attentive, asks good questions, doesn't waste the water or leaves when he practices. You can see him gaining confidence with each successful batch, the way his hands become steadier, the way he starts to trust his own judgment about timing and temperature. Thomas observes this teaching session from a distance, and you can't read his expression, but he doesn't intervene or stop you, which you interpret as approval or at least acceptance. The knowledge is being passed down, the skill is being distributed among more crew members, which makes the ship more resilient if something happens to Thomas or to you. It's practical in a way that pirates appreciate, even if nobody says so explicitly. The evening ritual is approaching. You can tell by the angle of the light and the way people are starting to migrate toward their usual spots on deck. Thomas begins his preparation, and you help without being asked, and he accepts your help without comment, and this feels like progress even though nothing visible has changed. The water boils, the leaves steep, the tea gets poured into cups that have seen better days and will never see good days again, and everyone settles into the comfortable routine that defines this particular moment of this particular day on this particular ship, full of people who chose crime but also somehow chose community. The myths about pirates that you grew up hearing are mostly wrong. You've learned this through direct experience and through conversations with crew members who enjoy debunking common misconceptions about their profession. The image of pirates as constantly drunk, constantly violent, constantly engaged in dramatic sword fights and treasure hunts bears almost no resemblance to the reality of pirate life, which is mostly boring labor, interrupted by occasional moments of terror and even more occasional moments of profit. Cork loves talking about the myths, which makes sense because Cork loves talking about everything, but he's particularly animated when discussing the gap between pirate legends and pirate reality. He tells you one evening, while everyone's drinking tea and watching the sun set in its usual spectacular fashion, that the whole rum-soaked pirate image was largely created by people who'd never actually met a pirate, writers and storytellers who were more interested in entertainment than accuracy. The truth, Cork says with the authority of someone who's been pirating for longer than you've been alive, is that successful pirates are boring. They're organized, disciplined, risk-averse when possible, focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term glory. The pirates who match the legends, who are drunk all the time and fight constantly and make dramatic gestures, those pirates die quickly or get captured quickly, and either way they don't last long enough to become the old experienced pirates who actually know what they're doing. You think about the raids you've participated in now, 4 total, and how none of them resembled the dramatic battles from stories. They were coordinated operations with clear objectives and exit strategies, more like organized crime than romantic adventure. The goal was always to get the cargo without anyone dying if possible, because killing people brings attention, and attention brings naval vessels, and naval vessels bring hangings. Better to be scary enough that merchant ships surrender without fighting, take what you need, and leave everyone alive to tell stories about how terrifying pirates are, which serves as free advertising for future raids. The sword fights in stories are apparently complete fiction, according to William, who has opinions about everything, including things he definitely doesn't have expertise in. Real fights with swords are brief and ugly, he says, over in seconds rather than minutes, ending with someone dead or seriously injured, rather than with dramatic dialogue and narrow escapes. Pirates carry swords mostly for intimidation, along with knives and pistols, and occasionally more creative weapons. But the best raid is one where no weapons get used, because everyone's too scared to resist. The treasure maps and buried treasure are also mostly myth, Cork adds, warming to his theme of myth-busting. Pirates spend their money as quickly as they steal it, in ports where merchants are willing to trade goods for coins that definitely came from legitimate sources and don't ask questions about bloodstains. The idea of burying treasure and making a map to find it later assumes that pirates are planning for the future and trust each other enough to share information about valuable hiding places, both of which are questionable assumptions. The democracy thing is real though, sort of. Pirate ships often operate with more democratic principles than legitimate vessels, with crews voting on major decisions and captains serving at the pleasure of the crew rather than through divine right or naval appointment. But it's a practical democracy born from necessity rather than ideology. A pirate crew can't function if everyone hates the captain, because mutiny is always an option when everyone's already criminal and has nothing left to lose by committing more crimes. Your captain got elected to his position 3 years ago, you learned this from Cork's endless stories, after the previous captain made a series of bad decisions that got crew members killed unnecessarily. There was a vote, and the previous captain lost badly, and he accepted the result because the alternative was being thrown overboard. and now he serves as an ordinary crew member without apparent resentment, because at least he's still alive. It's a brutal system, but it works. Keeps captains accountable in a way that legitimate naval hierarchies don't. The code that supposedly governs pirate behavior is real, but less romantic than the stories suggest. It's mostly practical rules about how to divide loot, what happens if you're injured during a raid, consequences for stealing from your own crew, and other basic guidelines that keep people from killing each other over disputes. Every ship has variations, but the core principles are similar across most pirate crews, an informal legal system that developed because even criminals need some structure to function effectively. You're listening to all this while drinking your tea, which has gone from hot to warm to cool during Cork's extended monologue about pirate myths. The sky has completed its daily colour show and settled into the deep blue that comes right before full darkness. Stars are appearing in their usual positions, because at least stars are consistent in a life where almost nothing else is. The younger sailor asks if pirates really say "R" a lot, which makes several crew members laugh, genuine laughter that's rare enough to be noteworthy. Cork explains that some pirates develop speech patterns based on their regional accents, and if those accents happen to include sounds that could be written as "R", then sure, but it's not a deliberate pirate thing, it's just how some people talk. The kid looks disappointed, like he wanted the myths to be at least partially true, wanted his criminal career to include some of the romance and drama that the stories promised. But the reality is this: sitting on a deck drinking tea while old men debunk legends, and the ocean does its endless water thing, and tomorrow will be exactly like today, except maybe slightly different, in ways that won't matter in the long run. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, it's just life, lived on a ship, by people who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, and now have to live with those choices, while drinking tea, and watching sunsets, and occasionally stealing things to fund the continuation of this weird existence. The relationship between tea and sleep is something you discover gradually, not through anyone explaining it, but through noticing patterns in your own exhaustion and recovery. Sleep on a ship is never good, that's just accepted reality, but it varies between terrible and barely tolerable, depending on factors you're still learning to identify and control when possible. The evening tea ritual, it turns out, plays a significant role in which category your sleep falls into on any given night. You notice first that you sleep better on nights when you participate in the full tea ritual, sitting with the crew through the entire sunset process, drinking slowly, letting your body wind down gradually from the day's work. On nights when you skip it, or rush through it because something else demands your attention, your sleep is worse, more fragmented, full of the anxiety and physical tension that accumulated during the day without anywhere to go. William mentions casually one evening that tea contains something that affects sleep, though he can't remember the name or explain the mechanism because his medical knowledge comes from observation and outdated books rather than any formal training. But he's noticed the same pattern you have, that tea before bed seems to help people sleep, despite containing the same substance that makes morning tea help people wake up, which doesn't make sense but is nonetheless true according to multiple sailors' experiences. The ritual matters as much as the tea itself, maybe more. The act of sitting, of being still, of watching the sky change colors while your hands wrap around something warm, it tells your body that the workday is over, that you can start the transition from activity to rest. Without this transition, without this clear boundary between working and sleeping, your brain doesn't know when to stop being alert, keeps running at full speed even when you're lying in your hammock trying to convince yourself that sleep is possible. You've developed a personal routine within the larger ritual. You always sit in the same spot now, the coil of rope that's become yours through repeated use. You hold the cup with both hands even after the tea has cooled, because the gesture feels right, feels complete. You don't talk much during the ritual, preferring to listen to other conversations without participating, letting the voices become background noise that's comforting in its predictability. The younger sailor has started sitting near you, not so close that it's obvious he's seeking proximity, but close enough that you're aware of his presence. He's developed his own routine too, mimicking some of your habits, which is flattering and slightly uncomfortable because you're not sure you're a good role model for anyone. But he seems to sleep better now than he did in his first weeks, seems less haunted by whatever he's trying to forget or escape, and maybe your influence is part of that, or maybe he's just adapting naturally like humans do when they don't have other options. There are nights when the tea doesn't help, when sleep is impossible regardless of ritual or routine. Storm nights when the ship is moving too violently for hammocks to be anything but torture devices. Nights after raids when the adrenaline is still coursing through your system hours later, making your hands shake and your heart race. Nights when someone's sick or injured and their suffering is too audible to ignore, but those nights are exceptions, unusual enough to be notable, which means most nights are at least tolerably manageable. The quality of sleep on a pirate ship is still terrible by any objective standard. You're sleeping in a hammock that's never quite comfortable, surrounded by men who snore and cough and make other biological sounds that you'd prefer not to hear. The ship is constantly moving, constantly creaking, constantly reminding you that you're suspended above deep water on a wooden structure that's held together by rope and tar and hope. But within these constraints, the tea ritual creates the best possible conditions for whatever rest you can achieve. Cork claims he used to have nightmares constantly, back when he was drinking rum every evening instead of tea. Dreams about drowning, about battles, about all the violence he's witnessed and participated in over decades of pirating. But since switching to tea, he says, the nightmares are less frequent, less intense when they do occur, more like memories than active terrors. You're not sure if this is true or if it's just Cork creating narratives that support his current lifestyle choices, but you want to believe him because the alternative is depressing. The hammocks are filling up now, the below-deck area becoming crowded with men preparing for sleep. You finish your tea, rinse your cup in the water barrel, and find your hammock among the dozens of identical hammocks. The ship rocks gently, the ocean is calm tonight, and you close your eyes with the reasonable expectation that sleep will come eventually. The collection and storage of tea on a pirate ship requires more care than you initially understood, because tea is both valuable and fragile, susceptible to moisture and pests and all the other problems that plague stored goods on ships where everything is constantly damp and nothing ever stays clean for long. Thomas maintains the tea stores with obsessive attention, checking them regularly, rotating stock, protecting them from the various threats that could ruin months of supply in a matter of days. The tea lives in sealed crates in the driest part of the hold, which isn't actually dry but is less wet than everywhere else. The crates get lined with cloth that Thomas changes periodically, checking for signs of moisture or mold, or insects that might have discovered this valuable food source. You've helped him with these inspections, learning to identify the subtle signs that indicate a crate might be compromised, needs to be opened and examined more thoroughly, possibly needs to have its contents transferred to a different container. Rats are the constant enemy, clever and persistent and always hungry for anything remotely edible. The ship has cats technically, though calling them cats is generous when they're really half-wild creatures that tolerate human presence in exchange for food scraps and warm places to sleep. They hunt the rats with varying degrees of success, keeping the population manageable but never eliminating it entirely, because rats on ships are like water on ships, a permanent feature that you can control but never fully remove. Thomas has developed defensive measures that go beyond cats. The tea crates sit on raised platforms that rats supposedly can't climb, though you've seen rats do things that shouldn't be physically possible, so you're skeptical about any barrier being truly rat-proof. Certain herbs get placed around the crates, plants that rats apparently dislike, though again, rats are adaptable and determined, and might simply tolerate the herbs if they're hungry enough. The moisture is harder to manage than the rats because moisture is everywhere, in the air, on surfaces, soaking through wood and cloth, and anything that's not sealed perfectly. The ship's hull is in constant contact with ocean water, and that water finds ways to seep inward through processes you don't fully understand but can observe in the damp patches that appear and disappear throughout the hold. Thomas fights this moisture through ventilation, through strategic placement of the crates away from the hull, through regular inspection and quick response when problems appear. You're learning that tea degrades over time even under perfect storage conditions, and ship conditions are far from perfect. The flavors change, become less distinct, more generically tea-like without the specific characteristics that differentiate one type from another. Thomas keeps track of which crates are oldest, uses those first, tries to maintain rotation so nothing sits too long, and becomes something you drink only because you have no choice, rather than because it's actually good. The raids are planned partly around tea supply, you've realized. When the stores are running low, the captain becomes more interested in targeting ships that are likely to carry tea, merchant vessels coming from Asia or India, company ships that are definitely carrying tea among other valuable cargo. The raids have multiple objectives, obviously, money and goods and whatever else seems worth taking, but tea is always on the priority list, right below weapons and medicine and above most other trade goods. There was a close call last month, before you'd started helping Thomas with storage management, when a crate developed mold that spread quickly through damp conditions that nobody noticed until the damage was significant. Thomas caught it before the entire crate was lost, salvaged what he could, but it was still a substantial loss that meant tighter rationing until the next successful raid. The crew accepted the smaller portions without complaint, understanding that waste and bad luck are part of ship life, but you could feel the collective disappointment, the awareness that the evening ritual was diminished even if not eliminated. The protection of tea stores is everyone's responsibility in theory, but Thomas's job in practice. Other crew members help when asked, participate in the inspections when Thomas needs extra hands or eyes, but the overall management is his alone, a role he's held for years through demonstrated competence and attention to detail. You're being trained as his backup, though nobody has said this explicitly. It's just understood that you're learning skills that make you useful if Thomas dies or becomes incapacitated, or decides to retire to a life where he doesn't have to fight rats for access to dried leaves. The younger sailor asks one day why they don't just buy more tea at ports instead of relying on raids and careful rationing. It's a reasonable question from someone who doesn't understand ship economics or pirate logistics. Thomas explains, with more words than usual because this is important, that ports charge high prices for tea, especially to pirates who are obviously pirates regardless of whatever disguise they attempt. The math doesn't work, the cost is too high compared to the value generated by drinking the tea, and besides, stealing tea is free except for the risk of death, which is a risk they're taking anyway for other cargo. The different types of tea create different moods, different energies, different versions of the evening ritual that you're only now starting to recognize and appreciate. Thomas has categories in his head, systems for deciding which tea gets served when, and while he doesn't explain his reasoning directly, you can piece it together through observation and pattern recognition. Some teas are for celebration, some for difficult days, some for ordinary evenings when nothing special has happened but everyone still needs comfort. The black tea is standard, the default, the everyday choice that works for most situations without being particularly memorable. It's reliable in the way that reliability matters on a ship, consistent and familiar and unlikely to surprise anyone. Most evenings feature black tea, and most evenings are unremarkable in the grand scheme of things, just another day survived, another sunset watched, another night approaching with its promise of uncomfortable sleep and eventual morning. The green tea comes out less frequently, on evenings when the weather is hot and the sun has been particularly brutal and everyone needs something that feels lighter, more refreshing, less aggressive than the morning black tea. Green tea has a delicate quality that seems wrong for pirates until you realize that pirates are just people who happen to commit crimes professionally, and people sometimes want delicate things regardless of their career choices. There's a white tea that Thomas guards even more carefully than the special red mark tea, uses so rarely that you've only had it twice in your months on this ship. It's subtle to the point of being barely there, requires attention and quiet to appreciate, and Thomas only serves it on evenings when the crew is particularly calm, when he's confident that people will actually pay attention rather than just drinking it automatically while thinking about other things. You're not entirely sure what makes white tea special beyond its rarity, but the ritual of drinking it feels important, feels like participating in something that requires respect and attention. The herbal teas aren't technically tea according to Thomas, who has opinions about these things, but they get served occasionally when someone is sick or when the regular tea stores are running particularly low and need to be stretched. These are made from whatever plants the crew has collected at ports or from islands where they've stopped for supplies, dried and stored and used when necessary. They taste like plants, which is accurate but not particularly appealing, but they're hot and different from water, and that's enough when expectations are low. You're beginning to understand that Thomas uses tea selection as a form of communication, a way to acknowledge the crew's emotional state without having to actually talk about emotions, which would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. After successful raids, the good black tea appears, the kind that has complexity and depth beyond just being strong and bitter. After difficult days when someone dies or gets seriously injured, or when storms have made everyone exhausted and miserable, the tea is simpler, more comforting, focusing on warmth and familiarity rather than interesting flavors. The younger sailor mentions one evening that he never drank tea before joining this crew, came from a family that couldn't afford it, never saw the point of paying for dried leaves when water was free, but now he associates tea with safety, with the end of the workday, with the moment when he can stop pretending to be tougher than he is,
and just exist as a tired person drinking something warm. You understand this because you feel similarly, have developed connections between tea and comfort that wouldn't make sense to your past self, but are completely natural to your current self. Cork has a story, naturally, about a ship where the captain tried to use tea as a reward system, only serving it to crew members who performed well or followed orders without complaint. The system failed spectacularly, Cork says, because it turned tea from a communal ritual into a hierarchical power game, created resentment and division, undermined the exact social cohesion that tea drinking is supposed to support. The captain eventually abandoned the system after a near mutiny, went back to serving everyone equally, but the damage was done, and the crew never fully trusted him again. The lesson, according to Cork's interpretation, is that some things have to be universal and unconditional to work properly. Tea can't be a reward or a privilege. Has to be a right, something everyone receives regardless of their performance or status. The moment it becomes transactional, it loses the power to create community, becomes just another thing that divides people rather than connecting them. You watch Thomas prepare tonight's tea, the familiar ritual playing out exactly as it does every evening, and you notice the care he takes despite the repetition. He's not bored or careless, doesn't cut corners or rush through steps, treats the 500th preparation with the same attention as the first. This consistency is part of what makes the ritual meaningful, part of what allows everyone to trust it, to rely on it as a stable element in an unstable life.
The relationship between tea and violence is inverse and significant, something you've observed repeatedly, but only recently articulated clearly in your own mind. The more tea a crew drinks, the less violence occurs internally, and while correlation isn't causation, the pattern is strong enough that most experienced pirates acknowledge it, even if they can't fully explain it. Ships that maintain strong tea rituals have fewer knife fights, fewer angry confrontations, fewer moments when disagreements escalate into situations that end with someone bleeding. You've witnessed a few near fights, moments when tensions between crew members reached the point where violence seemed inevitable, and you've noticed that these moments almost never happen during or immediately after the evening tea ritual. They happen earlier in the day when people are tired and hot and irritable, or late at night when someone's drunk despite the general disapproval of drinking, or during storms when everyone's stressed and exhausted, but not during tea time, not when everyone's sitting together watching the sunset and holding warm cups and participating in the collective pause. There's something about the ritual that makes violence feel inappropriate, out of place, a violation of unspoken rules that govern this particular time and space. You could be furious with someone, could have legitimate grievances that deserve addressing, but starting a fight during tea time would mark you as someone who doesn't understand how things work, someone who can't respect the boundaries that make ship life tolerable. The social cost would be too high, the collective disapproval too strong, even if nobody explicitly enforces this rule. William has a theory, which he shares one evening when you're both helping Thomas clean the tea equipment, that the ritual creates a kind of psychological buffer between work time and sleep time, gives people space to decompress and transition before they're trapped below deck together in close quarters. Without this buffer, tensions that built up during the day have nowhere to go except into conflict, but with the tea ritual providing release and transition, those tensions dissipate naturally before they become dangerous. The captain understands this intuitively, even if he's never explained it in these terms. You've heard him remind crew members during tense moments that tea time is coming, that whatever dispute they're having can wait until after the ritual, and this reminder usually works. People can hold their anger for another hour, can postpone confrontation long enough for the evening ritual to soften everything, and by the time tea is finished, the anger has often reduced to irritation or been forgotten entirely in favour of sleep. There's a practical element too beyond the psychological benefits. Fighting while holding a cup of hot liquid is awkward and likely to result in burns, which seems trivial, but actually matters. The physical act of holding the cup occupies your hands, prevents the kind of aggressive gesturing that often precedes actual violence, creates a literal barrier between impulse and action, and the tea itself, the warmth and the caffeine and whatever else it contains, affects your body in ways that make aggression less appealing, violence less likely. You remember a merchant ship you worked on before piracy, where fights were common, where someone was always nursing injuries from the previous night's drinking, where the captain maintained order through punishment and fear rather than through anything resembling community. The contrast with this pirate ship is stark. The merchants were supposedly civilized, following laws and rules and social conventions, but their ship was more violent, more chaotic, more genuinely dangerous than a ship full of criminals who drink tea together every evening. The younger sailor asks whether pirates ever fight during raids, whether the violence they avoid internally gets directed externally instead. It's a smart question. Shows he's thinking about the bigger patterns rather than just accepting surface observations. The answer is complicated. Yes, violence happens during raids, but less than you'd expect, less than the stories suggest. Most raids end with surrender and negotiation rather than fighting, because both sides understand that violence is expensive, results in injuries and deaths that nobody actually wants. When fighting does occur during raids, it's professional rather than emotional, tactical rather than angry. You're not fighting because you hate someone or because they insulted you or because tensions have been building for days. You're fighting because they're preventing you from taking cargo that you want to take, and they're fighting because their job requires them to protect that cargo, and both sides are performing their roles in a transaction that happens to involve weapons and occasionally death. This professional violence is completely different from the personal violence that occurs when crew members fight each other over grudges or insults or competition for status. Professional violence has rules, boundaries, expected outcomes. Personal violence is messy and unpredictable and damages the social fabric that keeps everyone alive. The tea ritual prevents the personal violence without affecting the professional violence, maintains the distinction between violence that's part of the job and violence that's just destructive. Cork mentions that some ships have adopted fighting rituals, formalized duels where disputes get settled through controlled violence with rules and witnesses. But these ships tend to have problems that disciplined tea-drinking ships don't have, because ritualizing violence still centers violence as the solution to problems. Better to have rituals that prevent violence entirely, that create spaces where conflict can be resolved through conversation, or time, or just letting things go because nothing really matters that much anyway. You wake the next morning to the soft clatter of cookware and the low, rhythmic humming of someone already in a good mood, long before the sun has decided whether it wants to rise. You lie still for a moment, listening to the ship breathe planks popping gently as they warm, rope creaking with the small swell, feet moving with that half-conscious confidence of people who have lived most of their lives on something that never stops shifting. You can always tell the emotional weather of the ship from these early sounds. Today, it's calm, unhurried, tea day calm. You stretch, feeling the stiff ache of yesterday's work in your shoulders, and climb your way up to the main deck where the morning light hasn't fully arrived but the sea is already pretending to be awake. William is at the small table near the rail, grinding tea leaves with the air of someone performing sacred rites rather than mundane preparation. He nods to you, but doesn't speak, another morning ritual. Words before tea are technically allowed but considered poor form, like shouting in a quiet chapel. The ocean is a smooth slate colour, and the air is cool enough that every exhale feels visible, even if you can't quite see it. A few crew members sit cross-legged near the bow, doing nothing but staring at the horizon the way pirates do when they're planning nothing dangerous at all. The ship is at peace, which means everyone is at peace, and you feel that familiar sense of gratitude for the strange little community you've found yourself in. When the tea is finally ready, William hands cups out with the solemnity of a priest distributing communion. You wrap your hands around the warmth and take that first sip, letting it spread through your chest like someone slowly lighting a lantern behind your ribs. The younger sailor, the same one who asked the question about violence yesterday, joins you at the rail. He looks like he hasn't slept enough but is trying not to show it. You've noticed he tries very hard not to show anything. That alone tells you he's still new. You ever get used to the rocking? He asks, breaking the no-talking rule but doing it softly enough that it doesn't count as a violation. Not really, you say. You just stop noticing that you notice it. He nods like this is wise, though you know it's just something you said because your brain isn't fully online yet. Tea loosens your thoughts the way warm water loosens knots, and you find yourself watching the young man out of the corner of your eye. He's curious, always asking questions, always listening. He might actually become a good pirate someday, which mostly means he'll learn when not to talk, when not to fight, when not to panic. The captain emerges from below decks looking like he's had too little sleep but has decided to compensate with excessive dignity.
His long coat is half-buttoned, his hair is doing things hair should not do on a grown man, but he has the posture of someone ready to command a fleet. You admire this about him, the ability to appear composed even when reality strongly disagrees. "Light wind today," he says, stating a fact that everyone can see but saying it anyway because captains must narrate their surroundings. "We'll be slow." He sounds almost pleased. Slow days mean extra tea. The morning tea ritual isn't as elaborate as the evening one. Evening tea is for reflection, for decompressing, for unclenching the jaw you didn't realize had been clenched since dawn. Morning tea, on the other hand, is for direction, for steadying, for preparing your insides for whatever nonsense the day may demand from you. You sip again and let your gaze drift across the deck. Thomas is inspecting ropes, humming off-key. Sarah is sharpening a knife that she definitely doesn't need to sharpen but enjoys the meditative action. Two older pirates, Baines and Corwin, argue quietly about whether the horizon looks different today, which is their favourite argument because it can never be resolved. Tea smooths all of it into background texture. It's strange how something as small as a cup can shape an entire culture. You've been on other ships where mornings were loud, chaotic, fueled by rum or bravado, or the kind of desperation that builds when people don't have something gentle to anchor them to themselves. Here, tea is that anchor. It eases you into the world instead of throwing you into it. Halfway through your cup, the young sailor clears his throat. "Is it true," he asks, "that some crews still insist pirates drink rum in the morning? Like, as a rule?" You snort softly. Some do. They also tend to have more funerals. He processes that for a moment, then nods again. You can see him comparing his expectations of piracy, the stories of drunken debauchery, the tavern fights, the reckless bravado, to the quiet deck around him, the soft morning tea, the pirates gently arguing about clouds like elderly poets. "This isn't what I expected," he finally says. "It never is," you reply, and it comes out softer than you intend, but it's better. The captain claps once, loudly, signalling that morning tea is officially concluded. You drain the last of your cup, feeling a reluctant end to the peace that settles in your bones whenever tea is involved. The day will begin now, ropes to coil, sails to trim, tasks to perform, but the calm lingers under your skin. That is the real point of this ritual, not the tea itself, but the state it creates. As you begin your work, you catch yourself thinking how strange it is that pirates, people known for chaos, rebellion, and a total disregard for civilized expectations, are held together by something as gentle as hot water poured over leaves. But maybe that's the paradox that makes this life survivable. You live with danger, so you learn to treasure calm. You commit violence professionally, so you avoid it personally. You sleep in cramped quarters, so you savor moments of open sky and warm steam rising from a cup. And you start the day the only way that makes sense anymore, with tea and the quiet understanding that without it, everything would be louder, harder, sharper. You would be different. The ship would be different. You aren't sure exactly when this became home, but sipping that last drop, you suspect the answer is sometime during tea. You spend the better part of the morning doing work that feels both necessary and unnecessary in equal measure, tightening knots that don't need tightening, recoiling ropes that were already coiled reasonably well, making repairs to things that weren't really broken but were irritatingly slightly imperfect. This is the nature of ship life. Half the tasks are real, and the other half exists to keep you from thinking too much. The wind remains sluggish, almost bored, and the ship glides forward with the pace of someone reluctantly getting out of bed. Nobody minds. Slow days feel like gifts, and pirates are surprisingly skilled at accepting gifts when they involve doing less, not more. By midday, the sun hangs overhead like a warm coin, and William announces, with profound seriousness, that he is beginning the process of preparing the afternoon batch of tea. This announcement is unnecessary. Everyone can see him cleaning the tools, but tradition demands it. And the crew reacts accordingly, shifting their energy downward, settling into that mellow anticipatory mood that falls somewhere between hunger and meditation. You find yourself seated on a coil of rope, watching William heat the water. The younger sailor approaches again, this time more confidently, holding a notebook he's been scribbling in since dawn. He hesitates before speaking, as if unsure whether what he's about to ask is allowed. "Why tea?" he finally says. "I mean, why did pirates even start drinking it? Isn't tea expensive? Hard to store?" "Not exactly. Pirate-like?" You smile and gesture for him to sit. "That's the funny part," you say. "Tea was cheaper than rum in certain ports, easier to trade for, harder to ruin, and much, much less likely to make half the crew fall overboard at night." He frowns, trying to picture pirates falling overboard at a rate alarming enough to provoke a cultural shift. Did that actually happen? "Oh, constantly," you say. "Before the tea era, you could lose 3 men a month just to recreational stupidity." He writes this down, which you find both adorable and concerning. The truth is more nuanced, of course. Tea spread through pirate crews the same way it spread through any community. Slowly at first, sporadically, adopted by the eccentric few who insisted on its benefits long before the rest of society caught up. Sailors noticed that a small cup before bed reduced nightmares, steadied hands, and improved moods. They noticed that morning tea sharpened their senses without making them reckless. And gradually, decade by decade, a pattern formed. Pirates, after all, are connoisseurs of whatever keeps them alive. You watch William pour the steaming water with a practiced elegance that is frankly unnecessary for the rough wooden tools he's using. He insists presentation affects taste, and while you're not convinced the universe works that way, you admit the tea always tastes better when he's the one making it. The younger sailor watches with equal fascination. "So you're saying tea made pirates safer?" "Not safer," you say. "Less stupid. There's a difference." He laughs. The sound is quick and surprised, like he didn't expect himself to make it. You notice, not for the first time, that laughter is rarer here than one would assume. Not because life is miserable, far from it, but because the rhythm of ship life creates long stretches of quiet, reflective mood. Tea fits into that rhythm neatly. When everyone finally receives their midday cup, the crew disperses into comfortable positions, some leaning against the rail, some lying flat on the deck, some perched high in the rigging with the steady balance of people who no longer fear gravity. You sip your own tea slowly, letting the warmth settle into your stomach. The conversation drifts lazily from one topic to another. The last port you visited, rumours of a merchant fleet carrying spices, whether seagulls have souls. This last debate is fierce but good-natured, and William concludes it with a flat declaration that the only soul aboard worth worrying about is the soul of his teapot, which he believes is becoming temperamental with age. As you listen, you realise something you've known for years but never articulated. Tea creates time. It stretches moments, softens edges, makes the minutes flow slower. Not like rum, which erases time entirely, but like a gentle hand on the shoulder, urging you to stay present. Even the captain participates in the lazy conversation for once. He sits beside you, taking a thoughtful sip before speaking. "If the wind doesn't pick up," he says, "we may spend the night drifting." "Fine by me," you answer. "Me too," he says. Gives the crew time to rest, and I can tell Logley gestures vaguely toward nothing in particular. They need it. He's right. You can read the crew the way someone might read weather signs. The slower footsteps, the longer pauses, the soft sighs from people who aren't normally soft. Tea is helping, but rest is overdue. As you bask in the warmth and quiet, the younger sailor asks his final question of the afternoon, one he clearly saved for when he felt comfortable enough to voice it. "Do you think," he says, "that tea changed pirates? Like, changed history?" You look at him carefully, considering how to answer. "Tea didn't change pirates," you say. "Pirates changed because they wanted to survive long enough to enjoy something warm at the end of the day. Tea just made that easier. History shifts when people decide comfort is worth protecting." You see the idea settle into him, slowly, like heat in cold hands. The sun drifts lower, the tea cools in your cup, and the ship, still barely moving, feels suspended in a moment of quiet that could last forever if the world were kinder. You hope, for now at least, that it does. You wake the next morning to the steady hush of water sliding along the hull, a softer sound than usual, almost apologetic, as if the sea is still deciding what mood it wants to be in. The wind has returned, weak but workable, and the ship moves with the lazy consistency of someone strolling instead of drifting. You breathe in the familiar mix of salt, damp wood, and faint leftover tea that always seems to linger somewhere in the air like a loyal ghost. The crew is quieter than normal for this hour, though not in a tense way, more in the way a household goes quiet on a slow Sunday. People move differently on mornings after a day of rest. They stretch more, they sigh more, they pretend to work for a few minutes longer before admitting that real effort might require an additional hour and possibly another cup of tea. You make your way toward the bow, where the horizon is pale and the sun is taking its time becoming an actual sun instead of a tired coin behind morning haze. The captain stands beside you, leaning on the rail. He holds his cup in both hands, staring at the water as though he's interviewing it for a job. "Tea's strong today," he says. You nod. William must be in one of his moods when he wants to fortify the crew's inner constitution, which is his overly dramatic phrase for adding more leaves than necessary. You can always tell, the tea becomes sharper, more decisive, as if it has opinions. The captain finishes his cup and gestures with it vaguely, like a man about to deliver philosophical wisdom whether you want it or not. "Funny," he says, "how rum used to be the answer to everything. Storm coming? Rum. Fight brewing? Rum. Someone feeling sad? Rum. Someone feeling too happy? Rum, but less." You give a small laugh. Rum was a tool, a medicine, a bribe, and a bad idea wrapped into one drink. For decades it fueled an entire maritime culture, naval crews, merchant sailors, privateers. The belief was simple and widespread. Alcohol keeps a crew functioning. Alcohol keeps morale high. Alcohol keeps men from becoming restless. Then reality demonstrated, quite efficiently, that alcohol also made people fall off ships, insult captains, punch officers, misinterpret navigation charts, lose essential equipment, forget essential equipment, hallucinate non-existent threats, attempt heroic but incredibly stupid stunts, and insult dolphins for being smug. Tea solved those problems. William appears beside you carrying the next pot, steam curling upward around his face. "Second round," he announces, though first round technically just ended. But nobody questions him. You accept another cup because refusing tea on this ship is roughly equivalent to announcing that you've given up on life. The younger sailor approaches cautiously, as though he worries that he might be interrupting a ceremony. "Captain," he asks, "is it true that some ships tried mixing tea and rum, like a compromise?" The captain closes his eyes painfully, as if remembering an ancient tragedy. "Yes," he mutters. "It was unfortunate." You decide to elaborate, because the younger sailor deserves context. "Rum-tea hybrids," you say, were an experiment born from desperation. Captains wanted the clarity of tea without giving up the morale effects of rum. Instead, they created a drink that made people both alert and reckless. It produced what some called chaotic productivity. Very dangerous. "Extremely dangerous," the captain adds. "Some crews became convinced they could see the future," you say. "Some crews believed they could outsmart gunpowder," he says. "Some crews tried both." The young man's eyes widen. "Did any survive?" "A few," the captain says, sipping. "But they all stopped drinking the mixture." The ship drifts into a stretch of calm water, and the sound of the tea being poured becomes disproportionately loud. You can feel the mood of the crew settling, smoothing, becoming cohesive in the way only a shared ritual can achieve. It's almost mystical, though you would never say that out loud because pirates mock anything mystical unless it comes with money attached. You lean against the rail, warming your hands on your cup. Tea has changed this crew in ways you can't fully measure. It's made mornings bearable, it's softened tempers, it's created order without requiring force. Rum, on the other hand, tried very hard to do all those things by breaking them first. The captain watches the horizon a moment longer, then speaks quietly enough that only you hear. Rum makes men believe they're invincible. Tea makes men remember they want to stay alive. You nod again, letting the warmth soak through you. It's true. Rum is fire, tea is gravity. Pirates used to think they needed fire to be fierce. Now they understand they need gravity to stay human. The bell rings, calling the crew to mid-morning tasks, and everyone slowly rises, stretching, preparing for the day. Their movements are unhurried, but not sluggish, just balanced, sustained by whatever peace tea grants them. As you set down your empty cup, you realize that the day feels manageable, the ship feels steady, and even the sea seems cooperative. It's not magic, it's just tea, and somehow that's enough. By midday, the ship is humming with quiet activity, the kind that looks effortless from a distance but is actually 1,000 small tasks linked together by habit. You walk along the deck, checking the lines, feeling the tension in each rope like a musician tuning an instrument. The wind has picked up slightly, pushing you forward with a polite insistence. Around you, the crew moves in that easy rhythm tea mornings always create. People speak softly, not out of fear or discipline, but because shouting would feel inappropriate. Even the gulls overhead seem quieter, circling with what you generously interpret as respect. The younger sailor joins you again, carrying his notebook like it contains the secrets of the universe. So he says, "If tea made pirates calmer, and calm pirates survive more raids, does that mean tea literally made pirates richer?" "Indirectly," you say. "Very indirectly." He waits for more, so you continue. "A calm crew makes smarter decisions. Smarter decisions mean fewer unnecessary fights. Fewer fights mean fewer injuries. Fewer injuries mean fewer delays. Fewer delays mean more successful raids, and successful raids mean more wealth." So tea created efficiency. That, you say, and fewer people yelling at each other. You watch him jot this down. He writes slowly, as though every sentence must be weighed first. He will make a good historian someday, assuming he survives long enough to retire into a profession with significantly fewer sharp objects. As you coil a rope, Sarah passes by with her usual half-amused expression. "Teaching philosophy again?" she asks. "Technically, economics," you say. She snorts. "Same thing." Far above, a lookout calls down that he sees a ship on the horizon, small, slow-moving, likely a merchant. The news spreads through the crew like a breeze, but unlike rum-fueled pirates, who would immediately become loud, excited, and dangerously impulsive, your crew reacts with composed interest. A few people straighten their backs, a few check their gear, one man yawns, someone else mutters, "Hope they're carrying spices." You glance at the captain, who is already assessing the wind direction, sail position, and distance with the calm focus of someone considering a game of chess rather than a potential fight. "Do we intercept?" you ask. He lifts his cup, he is still drinking, and says, "After tea." "Of course," the younger sailor blinks. "We're stopping for tea? Before raiding?" "Correct," you say. "But isn't that urgent?" "No," the captain says. "Nothing is urgent until after tea, otherwise people make bad choices." The merchant ship inches closer, unaware of the pirates having a philosophical discussion about optimal timing for robbery. You can imagine the reaction if they knew, pure disbelief. Tea is poured again, small portions this time, just enough to steady nerves and sharpen focus. Everyone drinks with the calm patience of people preparing for a job interview rather than an act of piracy. After the final cup is drained, the captain gives a single nod. Now, the ship springs into motion, not chaotic motion, but crisp, coordinated, almost elegant. Sails adjust, ropes fly, commands echo. The crew snaps into their roles with a kind of gentle precision you've only ever seen on tea-scented ships. As you approach the merchant vessel, they raise a white flag before you even get close. Some merchant captains have learned that fighting pirates famous for calm, structured raids is pointless. They don't act like bloodthirsty criminals, they act like businessmen with mildly inconvenient schedules. The exchange happens smoothly, polite even. The merchant's quartermaster negotiates. Your captain negotiates back. The younger sailor watches wide-eyed, clearly trying to reconcile his mental images of piracy with the diplomatic tea-fueled version unfolding in front of him. Within an hour, the cargo is transferred, the merchant ship sails off grateful to be alive, and not a single sword leaves its scabbard. The captain sighs with satisfaction. A clean raid is a successful raid. You feel the same. No injuries, no shouting, no drama, just mutual understanding and a quick transaction. Pirates may be criminals, but they're not irrational. Back on deck, as the crew settles into their afternoon tasks, the young sailor approaches you with the look of someone who has just had their worldview thoroughly reorganized. "Is this normal?" he asks. "For us," you say, "for tea-drinking crews, and rum crews." You take a long breath. Rum crews try to board ships before they've even agreed whether boarding is happening. They fall over rails, they shout threats with the wrong ship name, they misplace weapons, they argue about whose turn it is to be intimidating. He grimaces. So, chaos, loud chaos, you confirm. Sticky, flammable chaos. He writes again. You let him. Some lessons need to be written down so they'll stay. As the sun lowers toward the horizon, casting warm gold across the deck, you realize the raid felt like just another task. Not thrilling, not stressful, just practical. And maybe that's exactly what tea has accomplished. It has turned piracy from a reckless gamble into a functioning, peaceful enough existence. You exhale, feeling the last of the day's tension soften. The sea rolls gently beneath you. Someone begins preparing the evening brew. The younger sailor closes his notebook with a quiet thud, as though sealing everything he's learned inside. And you think, not for the first time, that tea didn't just change pirates. It civilized them, in the strangest way possible. You spend the next morning watching the crew settle back into their usual deliberate rhythm, the ship moving through soft swells that feel more like slow breathing than motion. The sky is overcast but bright, a pale sheet of light that doesn't commit to being either cheerful or gloomy. The ship accepts this half-hearted weather with the same tolerance it accepts everything else. People adjust sails, check knots, and carry crates with the calm efficiency that comes after weeks of daily tea rituals shaping the tempo of their lives. You find yourself thinking about how this wasn't always the way things worked aboard pirate vessels. Before tea became a central part of life at sea, mornings were unpredictable. Some crews woke with headaches, others woke with hangovers, and a few woke with no memory of the previous night's choices. Work began unevenly, arguments resurfaced with new intensity, and even simple decisions, like which rope to tighten first, became battlegrounds for bruised egos still soaked in last night's rum. Now the mornings have a soft order to them. The first pot of tea has already been served, and its warmth settles into the crew like an unspoken agreement. You see shoulders loosen as people move, you see hands steady, you even see patience appearing in places where it never existed before. The tea doesn't silence conflict, but it dilutes it, leaving only the practical problems that naturally arise when a group of people share a floating wooden home. You walk along the deck, noticing the small rituals that have developed. One sailor always checks the portside rail for splintering. Another takes responsibility for inspecting the spare rigging. William has made it his unasked duty to scout the morning wind and assess how much tea will be needed to match it. These small patterns give the ship its personality, and you sense that most of them emerged after rum was phased out. Rum created intensity, tea creates continuity. You pass the galley, where Thomas is sorting leaves with the patience of someone performing a sacred task. He moves slowly, but without hesitation. Every pile has its purpose, strength, clarity, calm, endurance. You've noticed that he adjusts the blend according to the mood of the ship, though he never explains how he knows which mood needs what. He simply feels it, the same way the sea feels tides. You continue down the deck, taking note of how little waste the crew produces now. The shift from rum to tea brought unexpected benefits. Rum barrels leaked, cracked, went sour, or spilled during storms. Tea, on the other hand, stores easily. It doesn't spoil, it doesn't slosh around, it doesn't tempt sailors into drinking more than they should. Even the leftover leaves get reused as compost for small boxes of herbs the crew tends along the quarterdeck, tiny gardens that soften the ship with hints of green life. The younger sailor works nearby, sorting coils of rope with earnest concentration. He still carries his notebook everywhere, but now he keeps it tucked against his chest instead of waving it around nervously. Tea has steadied him too. You remember how he looked when he first boarded, eyes darting, shoulders tense, constantly bracing for some unseen threat. Now he pauses to breathe before beginning each task, as though he finally understands how to move with the ship instead of against it. You watch the crew a few minutes longer and see something you didn't expect to find in the world of piracy. Endurance, not the frantic kind required for brawls or storms, but the steady kind that sustains long voyages, repairs, negotiations, and the endless, ordinary work of staying alive. Rum-fueled excitement, tea fuels longevity. You lean against the rail and let the ship's motion settle you. The sea is calm, the sky is a quiet grey, and the crew moves like an organism with many limbs and one mind. There was a time when pirates believed they needed fire in their veins to survive. Now they rely on something gentler, something warmer, something that asks them to pay attention instead of react. You realize that the real reason pirates preferred tea over rum has nothing to do with taste or tradition. It has to do with clarity, an ability to see the day ahead without fog or frenzy, to keep tempers at bay, to make decisions with the steadiness that life at sea demands. Tea didn't just change their habits, it changed their future. You breathe in the quiet morning air and let the clarity settle into you as well, knowing that this ship has become something rare, a place where danger still exists but chaos does not control it. By late afternoon, the sea has shifted into a gently rolling rhythm that rocks the ship with slow, even swells. The clouds thin until the sky becomes a muted blue, soft enough that it almost blends into the horizon. You move across the deck, listening to the creak of wood and the low hum of tasks being completed. Each sound fitting neatly into the unhurried tempo tea has carved into daily life aboard the ship. You watch the crew adjust to the changing light. They work with an ease that suggests trust, not only in each other, but in the ritual that frames their days. Tea has trained them to slow down before exhaustion takes hold, to breathe before tension hardens, to consider before reacting. Rum encouraged bravado. Tea encourages awareness. You stand near the quarterdeck as the ship makes a gentle turn. The sails shift, catching a more favourable angle of wind. The movement isn't dramatic, just a gradual correction, but you can feel how it changes the ship's mood. Every adjustment at sea is like that something small, creating a ripple through the entire vessel. You've seen crews crumble under the weight of minor inconvenience, and you've seen crews thrive because they treat minor inconveniences like inconsequential puzzles. Tea has nudged your crew toward the latter. You pause near a coil of rope and watch two sailors repair a frayed section of netting. They speak quietly, their movements steady. Repairs like this used to be hurried tasks performed by men impatient to return to drinking. Now they are approached with the same unspoken respect as the tea ritual itself. You sense that this shift has changed more than productivity. It has changed the ship's sense of identity. The sun lowers further, casting long, soft shadows across the deck. You walk toward the bow, where the air feels cooler and the sea opens wide in front of you. Ahead lies nothing dramatic, just water, sky, and the promise of whatever tomorrow brings. But you know that for pirates, this quiet stability is astonishing. Longevity was never part of the profession's reputation. Life expectancy was short, not because of the sea itself, but because rum clouded judgment at the worst possible times. Tea protects judgment. You watch the younger sailor preparing the lanterns for evening. His movements have gained a certain precision, not the rigid kind that comes from fear of mistakes, but the balanced kind that comes from understanding each step's purpose. The steadiness suits him. He lights each lantern with care, checking the wick height, ensuring the flame burns clean.
You sense that he feels pride in this responsibility. Not because it's glamorous, but because it quiets the ship and guides the crew through the night. The wind softens further as the sun meets the edge of the horizon. The light becomes warmer, spilling across the water in shimmering streaks. The crew begins gathering near the centre of the deck, moving almost instinctively toward the evening tea ritual. No one calls them, no one orders them. They simply converge, drawn by the rhythm that now shapes their lives. Thomas arrives with the pot, steam rising in a gentle cloud. The scent drifts across the deck, earthy, warm, familiar. You take your cup and wrap your hands around it, feeling the heat seep into your palms. The first sip settles everything. The world narrows to warmth, scent, breath, and the low murmur of shipmates nearby. You look around as the ritual unfolds. Each person pauses. Each person breathes. Conversations soften. A few smiles appear. Tea doesn't make people happy exactly. It just makes them more capable of reaching the place where happiness might appear if given room. As you finish your cup, the sun disappears completely. The deck grows dim, lanterns casting slow-moving halos of light. The crew disperses quietly, returning to small tasks or preparing for rest. The ship feels grounded, stable, almost content. You stand for a moment longer, watching the soft glide of waves against the hull. The sea is unpredictable, the future uncertain, but the ship feels prepared, not because the crew is fearless, but because they are clear-headed. Rum might have made them bolder, louder, more reckless. Tea has made them something far more valuable at sea, consistent. You step back from the rail, feeling the calm evening settle into your bones, knowing the tea ritual has shaped another day into something survivable, something peaceful enough to soften even a pirate's life. If you were to drift quietly across the deck of an 18th century pirate ship in the early morning, well before the shouting, swearing and scrambling of the day began, you might be surprised at how peaceful everything looked. There would be the soft creaking of wood expanding in the heat, the faint flutter of canvas half awake in the wind, and a low mist curling around the railings like a sleepy shawl. At this hour, the ship almost behaved as if it were a monastery rather than a den of thieves. And it was in this liminal space, between night's end and duty's beginning, that tea quietly established itself as the true captain of the vessel. For all the stories that depict pirates as creatures of pure chaos, the truth is that a ship only survived because of routine. Every inch of the vessel required constant attention, tar to be warmed, ropes to be pulled, planks to be scrubbed, sails to be checked for rips. The men knew that if even one of these tasks slipped into negligence, disaster could unfold. But routines are difficult to maintain in a floating workplace full of heat, noise, unpredictable tempers, and the lingering scent of aging gunpowder. So the early morning ritual of tea became more than just a beverage choice. It acted as a quiet hinge that swung the day open smoothly. On many ships, tea was brewed before the first order of the morning was even shouted. A pot might be left warming over a small brazier tucked between crates or shielded behind a barrel. It wasn't refined tea service, of course. No porcelain, no matching cups, and certainly no delicate silver spoons. More often, leaves floated freely in a battered tin pot, settling in friendly clusters at the bottom, forming a temporary constellation that no one particularly cared to strain out. What mattered wasn't the elegance of the drink, it was its return, predictable as sunrise, soothing as routine. The warm bitterness of tea brought the men out of sleep gently. It woke them without the jolt of fear or the haze of alcohol. And perhaps most importantly, it softened the edges of the ship's social tensions. A pirate crew was rarely made of lifelong companions. More often, they were men of different languages, origins, and temperaments, who had found themselves united in mutual opportunity more than mutual affection. Sharing a pot of tea in the quiet dawn made it easier for them to tolerate one another during the louder hours of the day. There was also a small sensory comfort in the steam rising off a tin cup. Salt and dryness permeated everything at sea. The hair, the skin, the breath, even the air felt parched at times. So the humid wisp from a fresh brew felt like a momentary reprieve. Sailors wrapped their hands around whatever vessel held the drink, letting the warmth sink into fingers numb from cold nights on deck. Tea became a place to rest one's mind for a moment, to brace against the day's uncertainty. Rum, by comparison, had no such power. It was loud where tea was quiet, coarse where tea was steadying, and disruptive where tea was stabilizing. Rum belonged to celebrations, brawls, negotiations, and the rough edges of pirate life. Tea belonged to the fragile spaces that kept those rough edges from cutting too deeply. It was, in a quiet way, the glue of the ship. What's fascinating is how few accounts mention tea openly. Many logs and journals focused on rations, storms, captures, and punishments, rarely on the gentle practices that helped sustain a crew's well-being. Tea slipped into the historical record like steam, visible, meaningful, and absolutely real, yet not something that chroniclers bothered to frame directly. And yet, its presence left an unmistakable imprint. Pirates preferred it not because it made them feel fierce or powerful, but because it made them feel human. As the sun continued to rise, the tea ritual dissolved naturally into the daily routine. The pot emptied, the cups were tucked away, and the ship stirred fully awake. By then, the men were ready, muscles loosened, tempers eased, minds focused. It was a simple thing, a humble morning brew, but aboard a vessel constantly fighting nature, fatigue, and the fragile balance of dangerous personalities, it was perhaps one of the most important quiet anchors they had. While the image of pirates calmly sipping tea at sunrise is charming, the beverage served deeper, more tactical purposes than mere comfort. Life at sea was not only physically demanding, it was strategically delicate. Every decision a captain made, from choosing a target ship to deciding whether to push through a storm, required clarity, discipline, and a stable crew. Tea, unexpectedly, supported all three. One of the most underestimated realities of pirate life was the necessity for sharp, coordinated action. Boarding another vessel required fast climbing, accurate aim, and the steady balance to cross planks mid-swell. Even tasks like adjusting sails during sudden wind changes demanded precision. A crew dulled by early morning rum simply couldn't function at the level needed to survive these challenges. Tea, on the other hand, sharpened them without overstimulating them. It delivered a mild lift, a slow unfurling of alertness rather than a violent snap into wakefulness. In fact, many captains quietly encouraged, or at least tolerated, morning tea because they recognized its strategic benefit. A sober crew could respond to danger swiftly, interpret signals correctly, and avoid costly mistakes. A ship chasing opportunity, whether treasure, cargo, or political advantage, could not afford even a single misjudgment while the sun was rising. This wasn't a matter of civility, it was a matter of survival. Tea also served as a subtle replacement for the water pirates often lacked. Freshwater barrels spoiled quickly, tanks grew algae, wooden casks absorbed flavors, and supplies dwindled fast under heat. Tea, boiled and steeped, transformed questionable water into something safer and more palatable. Even leaves of poor quality, the kind barely worthy of merchant counters, became valuable at sea. Heat killed bacteria, tannins masked unpleasant tastes. Rum could disinfect, but it dehydrated, and crews who leaned on it too heavily suffered fatigue, headaches, and reduced stamina. Tea kept bodies functioning in the sun and humidity far better than rum ever could. There is also the matter of discipline. A pirate ship was not a democracy, but it was not absolute tyranny either. Its discipline relied on mutual trust between captain and crew, on shared interest rather than rigid punishment. Tea became part of that soft social contract. When a captain provided space for the morning brew, he signaled that the crew's comfort mattered. It encouraged cooperation. The ritual gave men a predictable point of calm in a life containing almost no predictability. In a world of storms and cannons and sudden violence, tea was a promise of normalcy. It also occupied idle hands. While the water warmed and the leaves steeped, sailors performed small preparations, coiling ropes, tightening belts, checking weapons. These were gentle tasks that filled the early silence with a sense of readiness. Rum never produced such order. Its presence tended to scatter the morning instead of focus it. The strategic importance of hydration and mental clarity becomes even more obvious when considering long voyages. A pirate ship drifting between islands or waiting for a target could spend days in monotony. During these stretches, small lapses in discipline could grow into tensions, disputes, even mutiny. Tea carved out a daily space that reduced friction. It reminded the crew of shared necessity, shared rhythm, and shared humanity. In this way, tea wasn't merely a beverage, it was part of the ship's infrastructure. As vital as tar, nails, or rope, It quietly supported the mental and physical stamina that kept the vessel functioning. Pirates preferred it because it served every layer of life at sea, bodily, emotional, and tactical. And while the world would later romanticize their rum-soaked escapades, the truth remains much gentler. Tea, steady, warm, unassuming, was one of the most practical tools they had. The story of why pirates preferred tea over rum becomes even clearer when we shift our attention from the deck to the ledger. Those quiet pages of numbers and scribbles that, though rarely mentioned in adventure tales, determined the rhythm and survival of a pirate crew. For all their reputation as reckless outlaws, pirates were deeply entangled in the informal economies of the 18th century. They needed supplies, networks, alliances, trading partners, and occasional moments of goodwill from coastal communities. And within these hidden systems, tea emerged not only as a drink, but as a currency of practicality, affordability, and smart resource management. Rum, despite its cultural association with sailors, was not always cheap. In some ports it was abundant, but in others it became nearly unattainable, especially when naval patrols tightened or trade winds slowed the flow of sugarcane shipments. Prices fluctuated wildly, and scarcity drove costs even higher. Tea, by contrast, drifted through the global trading world in a steady, predictable stream. It came from multiple sources: British ships, Dutch traders, merchants from the Caribbean, smugglers from the American colonies. Even low-grade tea, the kind sold in bulk or swept from the floor of warehouses, was remarkably affordable compared to barrels of rum. This economic difference mattered far more than most romantic portrayals acknowledge. A pirate crew that spent too much on alcohol risked running short on tar, oil, fresh food, weapon repairs, and other essentials that kept the ship moving. Captains had to balance indulgence with necessity, always mindful of how quickly fortunes rose and fell at sea. A single storm could destroy their sails, a single cannon misfire could damage their hull, a single poor decision could leave them stranded on an island with nothing but good stories and empty barrels. Tea became an elegant solution to this constant vulnerability. A small chest could last weeks, a handful of leaves could flavour multiple pots. Even when stretched thin or brewed weakly, it still brought warmth and familiarity. Rum, meanwhile, evaporated quickly, in both literal and metaphorical senses. A barrel opened was a barrel emptied in a matter of days, sometimes even hours. It accelerated conflict, exhausted supplies, and created problems faster than it solved them. The economics of choice also extended to trade. Pirates were not only takers, they were exchangers. They bartered with coastal villagers for vegetables, water, clothing, and maps. They made deals with fishermen, shipwrights, and tavern keepers. Offering rum in these exchanges was often inefficient. Rum made communities suspicious, defensive, or greedy. Tea, however, was a calmer commodity. It signaled stability. A crew offering tea instead of rum projected discipline, control, and intention. This made transactions smoother, safer, and more predictable. There was also the matter of storage. Rum barrels were large and susceptible to heat. They expanded in the sun, leaked under pressure, and required valuable hull space. Tea, compact and lightweight, could be tucked into corners of the cargo hold without disrupting the ship's balance. It resisted heat better, spoiled less, and rarely attracted pests. Storing tea was like storing a dependable travel companion. Storing rum was like keeping a restless animal that demanded attention. Even the simplest aspects of daily life were influenced by tea's economic practicality. A pot of tea could be brewed during repairs, storms, or long waiting periods, without draining supplies. It kept men hydrated without throwing off their coordination. It did not interfere with their judgment in negotiations with potential allies. It preserved the ship's resources for far longer journeys than rum ever could. And while rum played its part in celebrations, toasts, victories, and moments of collective joy, tea played its part in endurance. It allowed pirates to stretch their resources, to avoid unnecessary expenses, and to maintain a cooperative atmosphere on board. It was, in a quiet but powerful way, the beverage that allowed them to continue being pirates at all. In these economic realities, mundane, unglamorous but essential, we see clearly why tea was not merely a preference but a strategy. It was the practical backbone of life at sea, the subtle force that kept the ship's world turning long after the wind died or the treasure dwindled. And though history rarely lingers on these humble calculations, they shaped the choices, habits,
and survival of pirates more than any dramatic tale of rum-fueled adventure ever did. When most people imagine an 18th century pirate, they picture a man permanently attached to a bottle of rum. The caricature is so widespread that it almost feels historical: wild eyes, loud laughter, sloppy swagger. But this legendary image, while entertaining, obscures a quieter truth. Pirate identity was far more layered, and tea played an unexpectedly central role in shaping the rhythms, moods, and internal culture of life aboard these ships. To understand this, we must first look at how pirates saw themselves. They were rebels, yes, but they were also practical craftsmen. They were labourers of the sea, navigators, carpenters, cooks, healers, gunners, sailmakers. Their lives depended on skill as much as on daring. A pirate who could not climb rigging quickly, repair a torn sail, or handle sudden weather shifts did not survive long enough to enjoy whatever treasure he might have seized. In this context, rum represented chaos, but tea represented competence. For many pirates, morning tea became part of their personal identity, their way of committing themselves to the ship, to the day, and to their craft. It didn't matter if the tea was weak, bitter, or boiled too long. What mattered was the clarity it provided. Even pirates who embraced rum during celebrations often treated tea as a quiet companion during the long hours when survival depended on calm senses and steady hands. Tea also connected pirates to the broader world. They were outlaws, but they were not isolated from global trends. The 18th century saw tea culture spread rapidly across Britain, the Netherlands, the American colonies, and the Caribbean. Merchants drank it, soldiers drank it, and families gathered around it at dusk. Pirates, moving between ports and capturing ships from every corner of the world, absorbed these customs in their own way. Tea allowed them to feel human in a life that often required them to suppress tenderness, vulnerability, and familiarity. Rum, meanwhile, served a different identity purpose. It symbolized defiance, celebration, and escape. It punctuated victories, soothed wounds, and filled the dead time after long voyages. But it never defined the structure of the day. Tea did. Tea shaped the quiet, invisible architecture of a pirate's routine. Rum shaped the bursts of intensity, the laughter, the arguments, the bold decisions, and occasionally the regrettable ones. This distinction between routine and spectacle is crucial. The myth of the rum-soaked pirate thrives because it is theatrical. It looks dramatic in paintings, novels, and films. But daily life at sea was not a performance, it was a cycle of repetitive tasks that required endurance, cooperation, and a surprising amount of patience. The men who survived recognized that stability was more valuable than bravado, and tea offered them that stability. Tea also carried a symbolic inverse to rum in matters of hierarchy. Rum was often controlled by captains or quartermasters, rationed out as reward, motivator, or tension relief. Tea, however, belonged to everyone. A pot poured at dawn did not need permission. It was communal by nature. Even the poorest sailor could contribute a handful of leaves or fetch the water. In this small but meaningful way, tea supported the egalitarian spirit that many pirate crews cultivated. A spirit that contrasted sharply with the rigid authority structures of naval ships. Identity, after all, is shaped not only by grand actions but by the daily patterns that give life texture. And for 18th century pirates, those patterns were quieter, steadier, and more tea-scented than popular culture ever acknowledged. The myth of the rum-soaked rogue entertains us, but it overshadows the men who lived real lives on real seas. Men who woke with tea warming their hands, who worked with clear minds, and who found in a simple brew a small but vital piece of order in a world defined by uncertainty. There is a point in your understanding of pirate life when tea stops feeling like a drink and begins to feel more like a tool. One of those quiet, indispensable technologies that people overlook precisely because it appears so ordinary. The more you observe the rhythm of the ship, the more obvious it becomes that tea is not simply something pirates enjoy but something they rely on. A device for sustaining physical health, emotional balance, and collective functioning. If rum is a burst of chaos wrapped in warmth, tea is a form of controlled stability, disguised as a humble cup. Survival at sea was never guaranteed. The 18th century offered a world of constant threats. Storms that arrived too fast, wounds that festered too easily, water barrels that leaked unnoticed, and illnesses that spread through cramped quarters like sparks through dry rope. In that context, the simplest health practices often carried the greatest impact. One of those practices was boiling water. Tea forced water to be boiled, sometimes multiple times a day, without turning it into a sterile chore. The ritual disguised sanitation as comfort. While other ships drank unboiled water and fell ill from invisible microbes no one yet understood, pirate ships that maintained strong tea habits benefited from cleaner hydration, reducing sickness in ways that no one could explain scientifically at the time but everyone could feel. Tea's warmth also helped regulate the body in harsh conditions. Dawn on the open sea could be colder than expected, with winds that sliced through clothes and joints stiff from sleeping near damp ropes. A warm cup in hand coaxed the body back into motion, making early tasks more bearable. Even in hot climates, tea helped sailors hydrate without overindulging in water reserves which were often limited. Rum dehydrated. Tea replenished. Rum fogged the senses. Tea sharpened them. Rum shortened the fuse on tempers and mistakes. Tea lengthened it. The physical effects blended seamlessly with psychological ones. Life aboard a pirate vessel required constant vigilance, but vigilance without rest quickly burned into exhaustion. Tea offered a middle ground, a way to stay alert without feeling wired, to settle without feeling sluggish. It softened the edges of fear, boredom, and monotony. It created a small, manageable pause in a world with very few places to pause. This mattered especially during long stretches between raids or encounters. These were the days when the ship felt suspended between purpose and aimlessness, drifting across calm seas with the sun pressing down and the future uncertain. Without structure, these periods could stretch the crew's patience thin. But tea created milestones that divided the hours, a morning pot to start the day, an afternoon pot to break its heaviness, an evening pot to slow things toward rest. It introduced an internal clock that required no bells and respected no national navy's discipline. It belonged entirely to the crew. Tea also helped pirates recover from the physical strain of their labor. The work on board was ceaseless, hauling lines, patching sails, dragging loaded crates, scrubbing decks. Muscles knotted easily, and injuries were common. A warm drink eased stiffness, encouraged circulation, and provided a brief moment of comfort in a life that rarely offered softness. Even the steam from the cup felt therapeutic, rising into salt-stung faces and tired eyes. Another element of survival was the quiet morale support embedded in the ritual. A ship was only as strong as the cooperative will of its crew, and morale was a fragile resource. Tea steadied it. The shared act of brewing and passing cups around created micro-communities on deck, tiny pockets of solidarity that reminded each sailor they were part of a functioning whole. A crew that drinks together works together, not because anyone says so, but because repetition enforces familiarity, and familiarity encourages trust. You begin to realize that tea is not merely a preference born from habit or taste, but a form of strategic resilience. It keeps people healthier, it keeps them calmer, it reduces accidents. It extends the life of the ship by extending the endurance of the people maintaining it. It even helps negotiations go more smoothly when the crew eventually does encounter other vessels or coastal communities. Rum, for all its glory and song and legend, cannot compete with that. It burns brightly but briefly. Tea endures. Tea sustains. Tea quietly carries the crew from one uncertain day to the next, with a steadiness that feels almost miraculous in such unpredictable waters. Tea, in its own unassuming way, is one of the reasons pirates survive long enough to become legends at all. By the time you've lived long enough at sea, you begin to understand that every ship carries its own political system. Some rely on strict hierarchy, some rely on fear, others rely on tradition, or religion, or the charismatic force of a single personality. Pirate ships, however, are their own strange creations, equal parts democracy, negotiation, and organized chaos. Within this delicate balance, tea becomes a surprisingly powerful political force, shaping authority not through command but through atmosphere. A pirate captain's authority is not guaranteed. He must earn it continuously through decisions that keep the crew alive, satisfied, and unified. Too much harshness leads to resentment. Too much leniency leads to disorder. The captain's role is more like a coordinator than a tyrant, balancing personal power with the crew's expectations. Rum complicates this balance. It fuels disobedience, encourages impulsive challenges, and creates moments when authority feels negotiable simply because someone is emboldened by drunken confidence. Tea, by contrast, stabilizes authority without enforcing it. When the crew gathers for tea, they do so willingly. The ritual aligns their attention, slows their pace, and equalizes their breathing. The captain becomes part of the circle rather than a figure looming above it. This shared physical rhythm reduces the emotional spikes that often precipitate power struggles. A crew that feels calm rarely feels mutinous. This calming effect extends to decision-making. Pirate ships often vote on matters such as destinations, loot distribution, and whether to pursue or evade certain targets. These votes require clarity, patience, and cooperation, all traits that tea enhances. Rum clouds them. You can almost track the outcomes of shipboard meetings by the beverage served beforehand. After tea, discussions tend to be measured, practical, and focused on the reality of risks. After rum, they tend to tilt toward boldness that verges on recklessness, with consequences that echo long after the celebration fades. Tea also shapes politics by reinforcing the idea of fairness. When tea is shared, it is shared evenly. The captain receives no special portion, and the newest sailor receives no reduced one. This practice subtly reinforces equality, reminding everyone that despite differences in skill or experience, they are bound by a single fate. Rum, however, is frequently rationed differently. It can become a reward or punishment, a way to manipulate morale or influence decisions. Tea cannot be weaponized so easily, and so it becomes the beverage of trust. Even the preparation of tea carries political significance. It is one of the few tasks that rotate among crew members, giving everyone a chance to serve the group. This rotation softens social tensions because it prevents any one person from dominating an essential ritual. It distributes responsibility and fosters appreciation for the quiet labor that keeps the ship functioning. The act of brewing becomes a small political gesture, a reminder that leadership is partly about service. Tea also plays a role in conflict resolution. Disputes that arise during the day often soften by evening simply because the crew gathers in a common space, their hands warmed, their voices lowered, their bodies anchored by routine. The ritual does not force reconciliation, but it creates an environment where grudges feel heavier than the effort required to release them. Rum accelerates the opposite effect, inflating anger and fueling confrontations that might have fizzled on their own. Perhaps the most remarkable political function of tea is how it bridges generations. Older sailors, battered by years at sea, often become mentors during tea time. They share stories, warnings, and small skills that might otherwise disappear. Younger sailors absorb this wisdom without feeling lectured to because the setting feels communal rather than hierarchical. Rum rarely produces such patient exchanges. Its social atmosphere favors noise, exaggeration, and bravado. In this gentle political ecosystem, tea becomes more than a beverage. It is a mediator, a stabilizer, and a democratic tool disguised as a simple brew. It smooths the edges of authority, softens disagreements, and creates a predictable rhythm in a life defined by unpredictability. In the end, the politics of a pirate ship are not shaped solely by power or danger, but by the quiet circles of companionship formed around steaming cups, where tensions dissipate and the ship's delicate social fabric repairs itself day by day. Long after you leave the deck, and long after the ship fades into distant mist, the influence of tea on pirate culture continues to echo across history in ways that are easy to overlook, but impossible to deny once you start tracing the lines. Most stories about pirates have been polished by mythmakers, writers, entertainers, admirers of chaos, who preferred the imagery of rum bottles clinking against wooden tables. But the quieter truth, the one that survives in journals, logs, and scattered anecdotes from sailors who lived through those years, paints a different picture. It reveals a world shaped not by intoxication but by deliberate calm, steady habits, and a beverage that asked nothing more of its drinkers than a moment of pause. The legacy of tea-drinking pirates shows up first in their surprising longevity. While many naval sailors suffered from scurvy, dysentery, and waterborne diseases, pirate crews with strong tea routines generally had better health outcomes, though no one at the time fully understood why. Future historians would later note patterns: ships that forced their water to be boiled, ships that avoided dehydration, ships that maintained morale through small rituals. All of them saw fewer casualties than their alcohol-dependent counterparts. Tea effectively extended the lives of men who were otherwise surrounded by danger. This longevity influenced the spread of seafaring knowledge. Pirates who survived longer passed on essential skills: map reading, deep water navigation, carpentry, gunnery, storm assessment, negotiation tactics. These skills filtered into merchant communities, fishing villages, and even naval academies through captured sailors, deserters, or former pirates who returned to civilian life. A healthier pirate population meant more experienced men transitioning back into society with hard-earned wisdom, subtle traces of which would persist through generations. The legacy appears again in the evolution of maritime discipline. Naval officers eventually began adopting mild beverage rituals, learning indirectly from pirate crews that calm minds produced better performance. Tea became standard on many ships not as an indulgence but as a stabilizing force. Even captains who despised piracy reluctantly acknowledged the practicality of practices that reduced conflict and improved endurance. Thus, the pirate inclination toward tea helped influence broader changes in seafaring routines. Another overlooked part of this legacy lies in trade routes and smuggling networks. Tea became a commodity that connected pirates to communities and coastal economies. These networks outlived the pirates themselves, shaping patterns of underground trade that persisted through the 18th and 19th centuries. While rum smuggling drew attention from authorities, tea smuggling was so commonplace and so socially accepted that it reshaped local economies in subtle ways. Villagers, harbour workers, and travelling merchants benefited from these networks, creating pockets of economic resilience that helped certain coastal communities survive turbulent market shifts. The cultural legacy is quieter still but equally significant. The idea of pirates as organised, cooperative communities clashes with popular depictions of them as unstable renegades. Yet tea rituals reinforced egalitarian decision-making, crew unity, and a sense of mutual responsibility. These values inspired later groups of labourers, revolutionaries, and maritime workers who admired pirate democracy more than pirate violence. Pamphlets and political tracts from centuries later occasionally referenced pirate customs. Not the rum-fueled brawls, but the daily cooperation that allowed outlaws to function like miniature republics at sea. Tea's influence also appears in symbolism. For many, tea became a representation of the quieter side of rebellion. It symbolized resistance not through rage but through composure, not through intoxication, but through clarity, not through destruction, but through endurance. In this way, tea echoed through the culture of secret societies, dissident groups, and small communities of workers who found strength in calm unity. Perhaps the greatest legacy is simply the reminder that survival often depends less on dramatic actions and more on the small, steady habits that keep people grounded. Pirates may be remembered for their daring raids and unpredictable lives, but their endurance came from these soft moments, the warm cups, the calm rituals, the shared breaths at sunset. In the grand mosaic of history, the significance of such quiet routines might seem disproportionate. But when you look closely, you can see how the steam rising from those old tin cups drifted forward through time, carrying with it the unspoken truth that sometimes the most powerful form of rebellion is simply choosing calm in a world defined by chaos. You stand at the rail during your final evening aboard, watching the sky shift from amber to violet as the last tea of the day cools slightly in your hands. The crew moves around you with a sense of unhurried certainty, their motions shaped by routines honed over years of survival. By now you understand these rhythms intimately. You know that the day does not truly end when the sun sets, it ends when the tea is finished, when the last sip smooths the final edges of whatever tension remains. The ship glides across a quiet sea, its timbers creaking in gentle, familiar patterns. The world around you feels suspended in a kind of serene balance. The horizon softens, the wind settles. Even the gulls seem reluctant to break the calm. You take in the scene with a slow, mindful awareness, knowing how easily it could have been different. Without the collective habits that brought structure to each day, without the predictable pause of evening tea, this ship could have been like so many others, fractured, exhausted, and undone by impulsiveness. As you drink, you feel the warmth seep through your palms and into your chest, spreading a slow, grounding steadiness. You begin to understand the true power of the ritual. It is not just the tea but the expectation of it, the knowledge that no matter how chaotic the day becomes, a moment of quiet will arrive. That promise shapes behavior, softens tempers, and smooths the jagged edges of fear. It binds the crew together not through force but through shared breath and shared warmth. The men settle on crates, coils of rope, or simply the deck itself, forming a loose circle without discussion. The captain takes his place among them without ceremony. Titles fade away. The ship becomes a temporary village floating on darkening water. In the soft glow of the lanterns, faces look gentler, almost contemplative, as though the tea has opened a collective doorway to reflection. You think of everything this ship has survived: the storms, the raids, the tense negotiations, the exhausting repairs. All of it depended on steady hands and clear minds. Rum could offer courage in brief, fiery bursts, but tea offered the endurance that made courage sustainable. It carried the crew across distances measured not only in miles but in moods. It preserved relationships, sharpened decisions, and held chaos at arm's length. As night deepens, the simple act of drinking tea feels like the final lesson the ship has to offer. It teaches you that quiet strength outlasts loud bravado, that stability is a form of freedom, that peace, however temporary, can be chosen intentionally. You realize that the calm atmosphere surrounding you is not an accident, but the cumulative effect of countless evenings just like this one. Each cup brewed, each moment shared, each small act of cooperation repeated until it became culture. Soon, the lanterns dim, the ship falls into a peaceful hush. You take your final sip and feel the weight of the moment settle into you. Not as sadness, but as a soft, enduring gratitude. Tea, modest and unassuming, has shaped the true legacy of this pirate world far more than any bottle of rum ever could. And as you prepare to leave the deck for the last time, you know that the warmth you carry from this evening will remain, long after the ocean breeze cools and the ship vanishes into memory. And now, as the story settles, you feel the slow drift of a quieter rhythm taking hold, like the long exhale of a ship gliding across calm water under a sky that has softened into deep blue. You let the details fade into distance, the creak of the deck, the warmth of the cup, the murmured presence of the crew, until they feel like gentle impressions rather than vivid scenes. The world grows slower in your mind, unspooling into a warm, spacious calm that asks nothing of you except to rest in it for a moment. You imagine the sea at night,